In the labyrinthine depths of Gotham City, where shadows writhe like living things and neon bleeds its sickly light across rain-slicked cobblestones, there exists a truth more terrifying than any nightmare the human mind can conjure. It whispers through the fog-choked alleyways, echoes in the hollow spaces between gargoyle-adorned buildings, and dances on the edge of sanity itself. This truth has a facia chalk-white mask of perpetual mirth stretched over features that mock the very concept of humanity. This truth has a name, though like everything else about him, even that remains a question mark carved in blood across Gotham's collective consciousness. The Joker. Picture, if you will, a scene that has played out countless times across the decades, each iteration more haunting than the last. A narrow alley, its walls weeping with decades of urban decay, where the distant wail of sirens provides a mournful soundtrack to the city's endless dance with madness. The rain falls in sheets, transforming the asphalt into a mirror that reflects not just the flickering streetlights above, but something far more sinister lurking in the spaces between perception and reality. And there, face down in a puddle that captures the kaleidoscope of neon from the street beyond, lies a single playing card, the Joker. Naturally, its edges curled and stained with something that might be water, but carries the metallic tang of blood. This image, frozen in time like a photograph from hell itself, serves as our gateway into a saga that spans more than 8 decades of terror, chaos, and that most insidious of human emotions, laughter. But not just any laughter, the kind that bubbles up from the darkest recesses of the soul. The kind that signals the complete breakdown of everything we hold sacred about order, justice, and the fragile construct we call civilization. The Joker's origina. But which one shall we choose? Therein lies the first cruel joke in a lifetime dedicated to the art of cruel jokes. Was he the failed comedian, desperate and broken, who tumbled into a vat of industrial chemicals while fleeing the scene of a robbery gone wrong? The Red Hood, leader of a gang of theatrical criminals who discovered that sometimes the mask becomes the man? Or perhaps something far older, far more primal force of chaos that has stalked Gotham's streets since before Batman ever donned his cape, a living embodiment of the city's capacity for corruption and decay? The beauty and the horror lies in the fact that all these origins are true. None of them are true. They exist simultaneously in the quantum superposition of comic book mythology, where continuity bends and breaks like light through a prism, revealing new facets of the same fundamental darkness with each telling. This is not mere comic book inconsistency. This is the purest expression of the Joker's philosophy made manifest in the very structure of his existence. He is the multiple-choice answer to Gotham's deepest fears, the variable in Batman's otherwise rigid equation of justice. Consider the imagery that has become synonymous with his legend. The crowbar, stained with the blood of innocence, and wielded with surgical precision against a boy who dared to wear the mantle of Robin. The camera flash, capturing in stark black and white the moment when Commissioner Gordon's world shattered like glass, his daughter's paralysis serving as both personal tragedy and philosophical statement about the arbitrary nature of suffering. The vat of chemicals, bubbling and hissing like the primordial soup from which nightmares are born, its caustic embrace stripping away not just flesh and pigment, but the last vestiges of human empathy and moral restraint. Each image tells a story. Each story contradicts the others. Each contradiction reveals a deeper truth about the nature of evil itself, that it cannot be contained within neat narrative boundaries, cannot be explained away with origin stories and psychological profiles. The Joker exists in the spaces between certainty and doubt, in the gap between the punchline and its devastating impact. He is Gotham's dark mirror, reflecting back all the city's corruption, violence, and moral ambiguity through the funhouse lens of his twisted perspective. Where Gotham breeds criminals, he creates artists of destruction. Where the city's elite hide their sins behind masks of respectability, he wears his madness like a badge of honor, painted in broad strokes across his death-white features. He is the question that Batman cannot answer, the equation that refuses to balance, the proof that sometimes there is no deeper meaning behind the chaos. Sometimes chaos is the meaning. But perhaps most terrifyingly of all, he is the voice that whispers in the darkness of every human heart, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the joke is on all of us. That perhaps the thin veneer of civilization we've constructed is nothing more than an elaborate setup for the ultimate punchline. And when that punchline finally lands, we'll all be laughing whether we want to or not. His philosophy, if it can be called that, is elegantly simple in its nihilistic complexity. Life, he argues through deed and word in the grotesque theater of his crimes, is nothing more than an elaborate Jokeia cosmic prank, played by an indifferent universe on creatures foolish enough to believe in concepts like meaning, justice, and hope. The only rational response to this revelation is laughter, not the warm laughter of shared joy, but the bitter, hysterical laughter of a mind that has glimpsed the void and chosen to dance on its edge rather than recoil in horror. This is why he obsesses over Batman, why their relationship transcends the simple dynamic of hero and villain and becomes something far more profound and disturbing. Batman represents the opposite response to chaos, the determination to impose order through will, to create meaning through action, to transform tragedy into purpose. The Joker sees this as the greatest joke of all, and Batman is either the ultimate straight man feeding him setup after setup, or the only other soul who truly understands the punchline but refuses to laugh. From his first appearance in 1940, emerging fully formed from the creative minds of Bill Finger, Bob Kane, and Jerry Robinson like some malevolent Athena springing from the head of Zeus, the Joker has represented something more than mere criminal adversary. He is the embodiment of entropy itself, the force that turns order into chaos, sense into nonsense, hope into horror. He is the dealer in a cosmic game of cards where the deck is always stacked, the house always wins, and the only prize is the privilege of playing again. Through the decades, he has evolved, adapted, transformed himself to reflect the fears and anxieties of each new generation, while never losing that essential core of anarchic malevolence that defines him. In the 1940s, he was the theatrical killer who announced his crimes by radio and left calling cards at murder scenes. In the 1960s, he became the colorful prankster whose schemes revolved around oversized props and elaborate puns. The 1970s saw his return to homicidal form, while the 1980s crystallized him into the ultimate agent of chaos, who could destroy lives with a crowbar or a camera with equal facility. The 1990s amplified his body count and expanded his reach beyond Gotham's borders, while the 2000s explored the psychological depths of his relationship with Batman and the Bat family. The 2010s brought body horror and theatrical grandiosity to new heights, while the 2020s have seen him evolve into a multimedia contagion, spreading his philosophy of chaos across digital platforms and inspiring new generations of followers who see in his message a reflection of their own alienation and despair. Yet through all these transformations, certain elements remain constant: the laugh that can chill blood in veins, the smile that promises pain disguised as pleasure, the unpredictability that makes him more dangerous than any weapon or army, the absolute absence of empathy that allows him to treat human suffering as mere setup for his next joke, and above all, the terrifying intelligence that underlies the apparent madness, the keen understanding of human psychology that allows him to find the exact pressure point that will transform a hero into a villain, a defender into a destroyer, a protector into a predator. This is the saga we are about to embark upon, not merely the story of a comic book villain, but an exploration of the dark territories of the human psyche, mapped through the adventures of a character who has become something approaching mythology in our modern age. We will trace his path from the pulp magazines and radio shows that inspired his creation, through the golden age of comics, into the silver age of camp and whimsy, and beyond into the Bronze Age darkness that revealed his true nature. The rain continues to fall in that archetypal alley, and the playing card continues to float in its puddle of reflection and regret. But if you look closely, if you allow your vision to adjust to the peculiar darkness that surrounds all things touched by the Joker's influence, you might notice something that wasn't there before: a slight upturn at the corners of the card's printed mouth, as if the image itself is beginning to smile. Before an origin, there was an idea, and Gotham was ready to hear it. Before the origin, the idea of the Joker, in the murky prehistory of Gotham City, before the first maniacal laugh echoed through its fog-shrouded streets, and before the first drop of Joker venom claimed its victim, there existed a landscape primed for the arrival of something unprecedented. This was not the Gotham of organized crime families operating with cold efficiency, nor the sterile metropolis of science fiction fantasies. This was a city caught in the liminal space between order and chaos, where the old certainties of traditional criminal enterprise were beginning to crumble under the weight of something far stranger and more theatrical. The Gotham that preceded the Joker was a city of masks literal and metaphorical. The wealthy elite hid behind facades of respectability, while orchestrating corruption on a scale that would make ancient Roman senators blush with envy. The police force operated under a code of selective blindness, their moral compass spinning wildly depending on the weight of the envelopes slipped into their coat pockets. The criminal underworld itself had begun to evolve beyond the simple brutality of traditional organized crime, embracing a new form of theatrical villainy that would have seemed absurd in Chicago or New York, but felt perfectly at home in Gotham's Gothic architecture and perpetual twilight atmosphere. It was into this fermenting cauldron of moral ambiguity that Batman first descended, his own mask and theatrical persona, serving as both response to and catalyst for the changes already rippling through the city's consciousness. But Batman's arrival did more than simply tip the balance toward justice. It fundamentally altered the rules of engagement in Gotham's eternal struggle between order and chaos. Where traditional law enforcement had failed through corruption or incompetence, here was a figure who operated outside the normal parameters of both legal and illegal activity, a vigilante whose very existence posed profound questions about the nature of justice, authority, and moral responsibility. The criminal response to Batman's emergence was swift, but initially conventional. Enhanced security measures, better weapons, more sophisticated planning, all the typical escalations one might expect when faced with an unusually effective opponent. But Gotham's unique atmosphere, combined with Batman's own theatrical approach to crime fighting, began to exert a transformative pressure on the criminal element. Why rob a bank with ski masks and getaway cars when you could orchestrate an elaborate heist themed around riddles and puzzles? Why commit murder with simple bullets when you could craft an elaborate death trap that doubled as performance art? This evolution toward the theatrical wasn't random, it was the natural consequence of Batman's own methodology. By adopting the persona of a creature of the night, by utilizing fear and symbolism as weapons, Batman had essentially declared that the battle for Gotham's soul would be fought not just in back alleys and boardrooms, but in the realm of the imagination. He had transformed crime fighting into theater, and theater, as any dramatist knows, demands appropriate antagonists. Enter the Red Hood, not yet the Joker, but the crucial intermediate step in the transformation from conventional criminal to agent of chaos. The Red Hood wasn't a single individual, but rather a mantle, a theatrical identity that could be assumed by anyone brave or foolish enough to don the distinctive crimson helmet and lead the gang that bore its name. This was criminal enterprise elevated to the level of performance, complete with costume, recurring cast, and a mythology that transcended any individual member. The genius of the Red Hood concept lay in its inherent anonymity. The helmet obscured identity completely, making the Red Hood simultaneously everyone and no one. Members of the gang could rotate through the leadership role, each bringing their own interpretation to the character, while maintaining the continuity of the brand. It was criminal franchise thinking decades before corporate America would fully embrace such concepts, and it represented a fundamental shift in how criminal enterprise could operate in the age of masked vigilantes. But the Red Hood was more than just innovative criminal branding. It was the crucible in which the Joker would eventually be forged. The anonymity that made the identity so practical also made it profoundly isolating. Whoever wore the hood became disconnected not just from society but from their own sense of self. The red dome of the helmet became a prison as much as a disguise, cutting the wearer off from normal human interaction and forcing them to exist solely as a theatrical construct. This isolation was compounded by the nature of the crimes the Red Hood gang committed. These weren't simple smash-and-grab operations, but elaborate productions designed to taunt and humiliate law enforcement while building the Red Hood mythology. Each heist became a performance, each escape a carefully choreographed dance of pursuit and evasion. The criminal acts themselves became secondary to the theatrical presentation. a dangerous precedent that would echo through every subsequent appearance of the Joker. The philosophical implications of the Red Hood identity ran deeper than its practical applications. By assuming a completely anonymous persona, the wearer was forced to confront fundamental questions about the nature of identity and self. If you could be anyone while wearing the mask, who were you when you took it off? If your actions as Red Hood contradicted your civilian identity, which represented your true self? These questions would prove crucial to understanding the psychological transformation that would eventually produce the Joker. Gotham itself was evolving alongside its criminal population. The city's architecture seemed to actively encourage theatrical villainy, its towering gargoyles and elaborate cornices providing perfect perches for dramatic confrontations. The perpetual fog that rolled in from the harbor created natural stage lighting, while the labyrinthine street layout offered endless opportunities for elaborate chase sequences. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, providing dramatic thunderstorms and torrential downpours with suspicious regularity. The media landscape of pre-Joker Gotham was equally conducive to theatrical crime. Newspapers hungry for sensational stories gave extensive coverage to costumed criminals, while radio shows dramatized their exploits for eager audiences. The public was becoming accustomed to thinking of crime in entertainment terms, treating real criminal acts as if they were episodes in an ongoing serial drama. This cultural shift would prove crucial to the Joker's eventual rise, as it created an audience already primed to appreciate his particular brand of homicidal performance art. Batman's own code was crystallizing during this period, though its full implications wouldn't become clear until tested by more extreme adversaries. His refusal to kill, initially perhaps more practical than philosophical, was hardening into an absolute moral principle. This created a fascinating dynamic with criminals who had no such restrictions. They could escalate situations to literally life or death stakes while knowing that Batman would always seek non-lethal solutions. It was a constraint that would prove both Batman's greatest strength and most exploitable weakness. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in the annals of criminal history. Gotham had developed the infrastructure to support theatrical villainy. Its population had been conditioned to accept and even celebrate criminal acts presented as entertainment. Its architecture provided natural stages for dramatic confrontations. Its primary protector operated according to a moral code that could be exploited by sufficiently ruthless opponents. All that was missing was the right catalyst, the spark that would transform all these latent possibilities into burning reality. That catalyst would come in the form of one particularly disastrous night at the Ace chemical plant, where the boundary between criminal performance and genuine madness would dissolve in a vat of industrial chemicals. But the groundwork had been laid years earlier, in the gradual transformation of Gotham from conventional city to theater of the absurd. The Red Hood identity would prove to be more than just another criminal personate. Was the chrysalis from which something far more dangerous would eventually emerge. The anonymity that made it practical also made it psychologically unstable. The theatrical nature that made it effective also made it addictive. The isolation it imposed made genuine human connection increasingly difficult, while the constant need to perform gradually eroded the distinction between role and reality. Comedy and tragedy, those eternal dramatic opposites, were already beginning their dance in the shadows of Gotham's criminal underworld. The criminals who adopted theatrical personas found themselves trapped between the desire to be taken seriously as threats and the inherent ridiculousness of grown adults running around in costumes. This tension between the serious and absurd would prove crucial to understanding the Joker's eventual philosophy, the recognition that perhaps the only rational response to an absurd universe is equally absurd behavior. The philosophical groundwork for the Joker's worldview was being laid in these pre-origin years, through the gradual revelation that traditional moral categories were inadequate to address the realities of Gotham's unique situation. If costumed vigilantes could operate outside legal authority in service of justice, why couldn't costumed criminals operate outside moral authority in service of chaos? If Batman could inspire fear to serve good, why couldn't others inspire terror to serve evil? If the normal rules had been suspended, why not suspend all the rules? These questions would remain largely academic, until the night everything changed at Ace Chemicals. But they were already present in the city's atmosphere, waiting for the right mind to seize upon them and carry them to their logical conclusion. Gotham was ready for the Joker before the Joker was ready for Gotham, primed for chaos before chaos had found its perfect avatar. When the curtain finally rose in 1940, the Joker arrived fully formed and, already, unforgettable. First laugh, Golden Age debut. The date was April 25, 1940. The place was Batman 1, page 13, panel 4. The moment was nothing less than the birth of modern comic book villainy, though the creators Bill Finger, Bob Kane, and Jerry Robinson could hardly have anticipated that they were unleashing something that would transcend their medium to become a permanent fixture in the collective unconscious of popular culture. In that single panel, rendered in the stark blacks and whites of Golden Age comic art, emerged a figure who would redefine not just what it meant to be a comic book villain, but what it meant to be the embodiment of chaos itself. The image was simple yet profoundly unsettling. A tall, thin figure in a purple suit, his chalk-white face dominated by an impossibly wide grin painted in vivid red, his green hair slicked back in a style that suggested both elegance and decay. But it was the eyes that truly captured the essence of what would become comic book legend, not the wild, rolling orbs of conventional madness, but cold, calculating windows into a mind that had passed beyond madness into something far more dangerous, perfect clarity about the meaninglessness of existence and the liberating possibilities such clarity offered. This was no ordinary criminal making his debut in the pages of Detective Comics' flagship character. This was something unprecedented, a killer who murdered not for money or power or revenge, but for the sheer aesthetic pleasure of the act itself. The Joker's first appearance established him immediately as a criminal who had transcended traditional motivations to become something approaching an artist, albeit one whose chosen medium was human suffering and whose gallery was the city of Gotham itself. The opening sequence of that first story set the template for everything that would follow. The Joker announces his crimes in advance, broadcasting over the radio his intention to murder prominent citizens at precisely specified times. This wasn't mere criminal arrogance, though arrogance it certainly was, but rather the behavior of a performer who understood that anticipation heightened the impact of the final act. The announcement served multiple purposes. It demonstrated his complete lack of fear regarding law enforcement. It terrorized the entire city by making everyone complicit in awaiting the promised murder. And it established him as a criminal who operated according to rules entirely of his own devising. The method of murder introduced in that first story would become iconic. Joker venom, a chemical compound that induced fatal paralysis while forcing the victim's facial features into a grotesque parody of the Joker's own smile. Here was murder, elevated to the level of signature art, each death bearing the unmistakable mark of its author. The victims didn't simply die, they were transformed into grotesque advertisements for the Joker's philosophy, their final expressions serving as permanent testimony to the absurdity of their existence and the meaninglessness of their demise. But it was the Joker's relationship with publicity that truly set him apart from conventional criminals. Where traditional thieves and murderers sought to avoid attention, the Joker actively courted it. He left calling cards at crime scenes not the practical markers of territorial criminals, but genuine playing cards, each one a small theatrical prop in the ongoing performance of his existence. These cards served no tactical purpose. They were pure artistic statement, declarations that these crimes were not mere criminal acts, but chapters in an ongoing narrative that the Joker was both writing and starring in. The radio announcements became a crucial element of his methodology, transforming him from local menace to citywide terror. By broadcasting his intentions, he forced the entire population of Gotham to become unwilling participants in his crimes. Citizens couldn't simply go about their daily lives ignoring the criminal element. They had to actively anticipate the promised murders, checking their clocks against the announced times, wondering if they might witness the promised spectacle. This psychological warfare was perhaps even more effective than the murders themselves, as it transformed every citizen of Gotham into an audience for the Joker's performance. The theatrical nature of his crimes extended beyond mere publicity to encompass every aspect of his criminal enterprise. His hideouts weren't simply functional bases of operation but elaborate stage sets designed to reflect his aesthetic sensibilities. His henchmen weren't mere muscle but supporting players in his ongoing production, often costumed to complement his own appearance or to enhance specific schemes. Even his vehicles were customized to serve as mobile advertisements for his brand of chaos, painted in his signature colors and modified to serve both practical and theatrical purposes. The iconography established in that first appearance would prove remarkably durable across the decades. The purple suit suggested both elegance and corruption, the refined taste of a gentleman combined with the moral decay of a monster. The white face paint wasn't merely disguise but transformation, stripping away the warm tones of human flesh to reveal something cold and artificial beneath. The red lips, painted far beyond the natural boundaries of human anatomy, created a smile that was simultaneously inviting and threatening, promising pleasure while delivering pain. Most crucially, the green hair defied natural order in a way that suggested deeper disturbance. This wasn't the result of premature aging or genetic quirk, but something fundamentally unnatural, a violation of biological norms that hinted at the violation of moral norms that defined his character. Every aspect of his appearance served to mark him as something that had moved beyond conventional human categories, a figure who existed in the liminal space between human and monster, performer and predator. The dynamic established between Batman and the Joker in that first encounter would define their relationship across 8 decades of storytelling. Where Batman represented order, justice, and rational response to chaos, the Joker embodied entropy, injustice, and gleeful embrace of irrationality. But the relationship was more complex than simple opposition, was symbiotic in ways that both characters would struggle to understand and accept. Batman's methodology created the perfect environment for the Joker's theatrical approach to crime. The Dark Knight's own dramatic persona, his use of fear and symbolism as weapons, his tendency toward elaborate detective work and spectacular confrontations, all of these elements provided the Joker with the ideal audience and opponent for his criminal performances. Batman wasn't merely trying to stop the Joker's crimes. He was being drawn into participating in them as unwilling co-star in an ongoing drama that the Joker was directing. The Joker's apparent ability to cheat death, demonstrated in that very first story when he appeared to die only to return for subsequent crimes, established another crucial element of his mythology. This wasn't mere comic book convenience, but a fundamental aspect of his nature. He existed outside normal categories of life and death, just as he existed outside normal categories of sanity and morality. Death, for the Joker, was simply another costume to try on temporarily, before returning to his preferred role as agent of chaos. The chess match aspect of their relationship was evident from the beginning. The Joker's crimes weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned provocations designed to draw Batman into increasingly elaborate scenarios. Each crime was simultaneously an end in itself and a move in a larger game, with Batman as both opponent and prize. The Joker wasn't simply trying to evade capture. He was trying to prove that his worldview was correct, that chaos was more fundamental than order, that meaninglessness was more honest than meaning. Batman's refusal to kill, established early in his career and tested immediately by the Joker's escalating provocations, created a fascinating dynamic that would define their relationship. The Joker could escalate situations to literally life-or-death stakes while knowing that Batman would always seek non-lethal solutions. This created both opportunity and frustration for the Clown Prince of Crime. Opportunity, because it meant their game could continue indefinitely. Frustration, because Batman's moral restraint prevented the ultimate resolution that the Joker's philosophy seemed to demand. The impact of that first appearance extended far beyond the immediate story. Here was a villain who combined the theatrical flair of pulp fiction with genuine menace, who operated according to comprehensible if twisted logic while remaining fundamentally unpredictable. The Joker represented something new in popular fiction: a criminal who was simultaneously completely rational and utterly insane, whose actions followed clear patterns while defying logical prediction. The artistic team that created him had struck upon something profound about the nature of evil itself. The Joker wasn't motivated by the usual criminal desires for wealth, power, or revenge. He was motivated by something far more disturbing: the desire to prove that existence itself was a joke, that the structures and beliefs that gave life meaning were elaborate self-deceptions that could be shattered by the right application of chaos and cruelty. In creating the Joker, Finger, Kane, and Robinson, had inadvertently tapped into ancient mythological archetypes: the trickster figure who challenged social order, the chaos agent who revealed the arbitrary nature of conventional morality, the fool whose apparent madness contained disturbing insights into the nature of reality. But they had translated these archetypal elements into a distinctly modern context, creating a villain who spoke to the anxieties and uncertainties of the industrial age while maintaining the timeless appeal of mythological chaos. As that first story concluded with the Joker's apparent death and immediate resurrection, the template was complete. Here was a villain who could die and return, who could be defeated but never truly conquered, who represented not merely criminal opposition but philosophical challenge to everything Batman represented. The stage was set for a conflict that would endure across decades, a battle not just between hero and villain, but between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews. The laugh softened in the Silver Age, but only to bide time. The Clown Prince era, Silver Age. The transformation that befell the Joker during the Silver Age of comics represents one of the most dramatic character rehabilitations in the history of popular fiction. Though whether it truly constituted rehabilitation or merely strategic repositioning would remain a matter of scholarly debate among comic historians for decades to come. As the Comics Code Authority imposed its sanitizing influence across the industry in the 1950s, the homicidal maniac who had terrorized Gotham's citizens with chemical weapons and elaborate death traps found himself recast as something altogether different. A whimsical prankster whose schemes revolved around oversized props, elaborate puns, and criminal enterprises so cartoonish they seemed designed more to amuse children than terrify adults. Yet beneath this seemingly radical transformation lay a continuity of character that spoke to the Joker's fundamental adaptability and the enduring power of his core concept. Where the Golden Age Joker had been a theatrical killer, the Silver Age version became a theatrical criminal, trading lethal Joker venom for harmless laughing gas, swapping elaborate murder schemes for equally elaborate but non-fatal capers. The theatrical nature remained constant. Only the stakes had changed, and perhaps only temporarily. The visual evolution during this period was subtle but significant. The harsh, angular features of the Golden Age Joker softened into something more approachable, his death's head grin becoming merely mischievous rather than menacing. The purple suit remained, but its cut became more contemporary, reflecting the fashion sensibilities of the 1950s and 1960s. Most notably, his crimes began to incorporate a level of whimsy that would have been unthinkable in his original incarnation giant playing cards. Enormous joke props, vehicles shaped like fish or ice cream cones, hideouts themed around carnival attractions. The introduction of Gaggy, his diminutive henchman, exemplified the new direction. Where the Golden Age Joker had surrounded himself with conventional criminals who served purely functional roles in his schemes, Gaggy represented something entirely new: a sidekick who existed primarily for comic relief, whose loyalty to the Joker seemed based more on shared appreciation for elaborate pranks than fear of violent retribution. The relationship between the Joker and Gaggy suggested that the Clown Prince of Crime had developed something approaching normal human affection, albeit expressed through the medium of criminal collaboration. The schemes themselves became increasingly elaborate productions that prioritized spectacle over practicality. The Joker's plan to steal a series of fish themed around jokes, his elaborate attempts to corner Gotham's market in comedy props, his construction of a giant jack-in-the-box designed to launch him over the city's skylines, capers bore little resemblance to conventional criminal enterprise, and even less to the murderous plots of his Golden Age incarnation. They represented something closer to performance art, albeit performance art with a profit motive. This transformation wasn't merely cosmetic but reflected a fundamental shift in how the character was positioned within the expanding Batman mythology. The Silver Age saw the introduction of the Bat family: Robin, Batwoman, Batgirl, and eventually Batdog and Batmite, creating a more child-friendly tone for Batman stories that required equally child-friendly villains. The Joker's evolution from killer to prankster served this narrative need while maintaining his status as Batman's primary antagonist. The dynamic between Batman and the Joker during this period became something approaching a game, with rules understood by both participants if never explicitly stated. The Joker would announce his crimes with typical theatrical flair. Batman would investigate and pursue. Elaborate chase sequences would ensue through Gotham's increasingly fantastical architecture, and eventually the Joker would be captured and returned to prison, only to escape and begin the cycle anew. It was a dance they had perfected, each knowing his role and performing it with professional competence. Yet even in his sanitized incarnation, elements of the Joker's deeper nature continued to surface. His schemes, while non-lethal, still demonstrated a fundamental disregard for public safety and social order. His pranks, while not murderous, still revealed a cruel streak that took pleasure in humiliation and embarrassment. His relationship with Batman, while more playful, still carried undertones of genuine obsession and mutual dependence that suggested darker possibilities lurking beneath the surface. The media savvy that had characterized the Joker from his first appearance evolved during this period to encompass new forms of publicity and self-promotion. Where the Golden Age Joker had used radio announcements to terrorize the city, his Silver Age counterpart employed television appearances, newspaper interviews, and publicity stunts to build his brand as Gotham's premier criminal entertainer. He began to treat his criminal career as a form of show business, complete with fan mail, merchandise, and public appearances. This commercialization of his criminal persona represented a fascinating evolution in his character. The recognition that his true product wasn't theft or violence but entertainment, and that criminal activity was merely the medium through which he delivered that entertainment to his audience. The Joker had essentially become Gotham's first criminal celebrity, famous not just for his crimes, but for the style and creativity with which he committed them. The technological aspects of his schemes also evolved to reflect the science fiction sensibilities of the Silver Age. Giant robots shaped like joke props, elaborate computer systems disguised as carnival games, spacecraft designed to look like enormous chattering teeth. The Joker embraced the era's fascination with advanced technology, while maintaining his commitment to theatrical presentation. These weren't mere crimes, but demonstrations of what criminal enterprise could accomplish when unrestrained by conventional thinking or ethical limitations. The psychological complexity that would become central to later interpretations of the character was present, but understated during this period. The Silver Age Joker showed hints of genuine loneliness beneath his criminal activities, a desire for recognition and appreciation that went beyond mere ego. His elaborate schemes often seemed designed as much to impress Batman as to achieve their stated criminal objectives, suggesting a relationship that had evolved from simple antagonism to something approaching twisted friendship. The evolving Bat family provided new targets and new dynamics for the Joker's schemes. His interactions with Robin introduced an element of mentorship. Gone wrong here was an adult criminal who understood young people in ways that conventional villains could not, whose childlike sense of play made him simultaneously more appealing and more dangerous to juvenile audiences. The presence of Batwoman and Batgirl created opportunities for schemes that incorporated elements of romance and courtship, albeit twisted through the Joker's unique perspective on human relationships. Gotham City itself evolved during this period to better accommodate the Joker's new approach to criminal enterprise. The grimy, realistic, urban environment of the Golden Age gave way to a more fantastical setting, where giant props and elaborate death traps seemed perfectly natural. The city's architecture became increasingly vertical and theatrical, providing natural stages for the kinds of elaborate chase sequences and confrontations that the Silver Age Joker preferred. The question of the Joker's sanity became more complex during this period. Where the Golden Age version was clearly and dangerously insane, the Silver Age Joker seemed to occupy a more ambiguous psychological space. His crimes were too elaborate, and his planning too sophisticated to suggest genuine mental illness. Yet his methods were too theatrical, and his motivations too unconventional to suggest normal criminal psychology. He existed in a gray area between sanity and madness that would prove crucial to later character development. The moral dimensions of the character also shifted during this period. While his schemes were less lethal, they often involved greater collateral damage to Gotham's social fabric. His pranks disrupted public events, his capers caused massive traffic jams and property damage, his publicity stunts created public disturbances that affected thousands of innocent citizens. The Joker had discovered that he could terrorize a city without actually killing anyone, that chaos could be spread through inconvenience and embarrassment, as effectively as through violence. This recognition would prove crucial to his later evolution. The Silver Age Joker learned that his true power lay not in his capacity for violence, but in his ability to disrupt social order, to transform the familiar into the absurd, to make normal life impossible through the constant threat of unexpected chaos. These lessons would serve him well when the Comics Code's restrictions were eventually lifted and he was free to return to more lethal pursuits. The supporting cast that surrounded the Silver Age Joker reflected his evolution from solitary killer to criminal entertainer. Beyond gaggy, he accumulated a rotating roster of henchmen and accomplices who served more as audiences for his performances than as practical criminal assets. These characters allowed him to demonstrate his comedic theories and rehearse his elaborate schemes, providing the appreciation and feedback that his theatrical nature demanded. As the Silver Age drew to a close, subtle signs began to emerge that the Joker's transformation had been less complete than it appeared. His schemes grew slightly more elaborate, his pranks carried hints of genuine malice, his obsession with Batman deepened in ways that suggested the old homicidal impulses were merely dormant rather than extinct. The colorful, whimsical criminal of the 1950s and early 1960s was preparing for another metamorphosis, one that would reveal that his capacity for murder had never truly disappeared, but had simply been waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. The legacy of the Silver Age Joker would prove more significant than critics initially recognized. During this period, he had learned to weaponize absurdity itself, to transform comedy into a form of psychological warfare, to demonstrate that chaos could be spread through laughter as effectively as through screams. He had also established himself as a multimedia phenomenon, expanding beyond comic books into television, toys, and merchandise that introduced his image to audiences who had never read his original stories. Most importantly, the Silver Age had allowed the Joker to evolve from simple killer into something far more complex and dangerous, a philosopher of chaos who had learned to package his nihilistic worldview in forms palatable to mass audiences. The skills he had developed as a criminal entertainer would serve him well when he eventually returned to his murderous roots, providing him with sophisticated understanding of publicity, psychology, and performance that would make his later crimes far more effective than his original killing sprees. The stage was set for his next transformation, one that would combine the theatrical flair of his Silver Age incarnation with the lethal purpose of his Golden Age origins. The Comics Code's influence was beginning to wane. Social attitudes toward violence in entertainment were shifting, and Batman himself was evolving toward darker, more psychologically complex storytelling. The Joker was ready to evolve as well, to reclaim his position as one of fiction's most dangerous villains, while retaining all the sophistication he had gained during his years as a mere prankster. Then Gotham remembered fear and Joker remembered blood. The Bronze Age turned from prankster to predator. The year was 1973, and something had shifted in the cultural atmosphere surrounding comic books, something that would prove as significant for the medium as the introduction of the Comics Code had been 2 decades earlier. Social attitudes toward violence and psychological complexity in entertainment were evolving. Driven by a generation that had grown up with the sanitized heroes of the Silver Age, but was now demanding stories that reflected the moral ambiguity and brutal realities of the world beyond the comic page. Into this changed landscape stepped a figure who seemed almost eager to test the new boundaries, to explore just how far the medium could push into territory that had been forbidden for nearly 20 years. The Joker was coming home. The Joker's Five-Way Revenge, published in Batman 250, won and crafted by the masterful hand of Dennis O'Neil with Irv Novik's haunting artwork, represented more than merely another villain's return from comic book limbo. It was a deliberate resurrection, a calculated restoration of everything that had made the character genuinely terrifying during his Golden Age appearances, combined with all the theatrical sophistication and psychological complexity he had acquired during his Silver Age evolution. The result was something unprecedented in comic book villain character who possessed both the raw killing instinct of a predator and the refined sensibilities of a performance artist. The story's opening sequence established immediately that this was not the whimsical prankster who had dominated Batman stories throughout the previous decade. The Joker's first appearance showed him methodically planning the murders of 5 men who had betrayed him years earlier. his death's head grin restored to its original menacing proportions, his cold calculation evident in every panel. The elaborate death traps were back, but now they served dual purposes. They were simultaneously practical methods of execution and artistic statements about the nature of justice, betrayal, and cosmic irony. The psychological complexity that O'Neill brought to the character represented a quantum leap forward in comic book characterization. This Joker wasn't simply insane in the conventional sense, he was something far more disturbing. A figure who had achieved a kind of twisted clarity about the arbitrary nature of existence and had chosen to embrace that arbitrariness as a guiding philosophy. His murders weren't random acts of violence, but carefully considered responses to a universe that he had concluded was fundamentally meaningless. His victims selected not just for personal grievances, but as representatives of the various categories of human foolishness that he felt compelled to punish. The 5 victims of his revenge scheme each represented different aspects of conventional morality and social organization that the Joker had come to despise. The corrupt politician who had sold his vote for personal gain, the businessman who had betrayed his partners for profit, the lawyer who had twisted justice to serve his own ends, the police officer who had abandoned his duty for money, the judge who had perverted the law for personal advantage. Each murder was crafted not just to eliminate the individual, but to make a statement about the corruption that the Joker saw as endemic to organized society. The death traps themselves had evolved significantly from their Silver Age incarnations. Where the earlier versions had been elaborate but essentially harmless pranks, these new devices were ingenious combinations of theatrical presentation and lethal efficiency. The judge who found himself trapped in a courtroom where the jury box was filled with dynamite and the gavel was connected to the detonator. The businessman who discovered that his office elevator had been converted into a gas chamber. The politician who learned that his podium had been rigged to electrocute him when he reached the climax of his speech. Each trap demonstrated the Joker's evolution from simple killer to philosopher of chaos. The theatrical elements weren't mere window dressing, but integral components of his message that the institutions and rituals that people relied upon for security and meaning could be transformed into instruments of destruction with the right application of creativity and malice. The Joker wasn't just killing his victims. He was demonstrating that the very foundations of their existence were built on quicksand. The relationship between Batman and the Joker, which had become almost friendly during the Silver Age, was restored to its original tension but with new layers of psychological complexity. Batman's pursuit of the Joker wasn't simply a matter of law enforcement, but a philosophical battle between two irreconcilable worldviews. The Dark Knight represented the belief that meaning could be created through action, that justice could be imposed upon chaos through will and determination. The Joker represented the opposing view that chaos was the fundamental state of existence, and that attempts to impose order were not merely futile but actively harmful to genuine understanding. This philosophical dimension elevated their conflict beyond simple good versus evil into something approaching theological debate. Batman's refusal to kill the Joker wasn't merely moral squeamishness, but a fundamental rejection of the Joker's worldview. To kill would be to admit that chaos had won, that the only response to meaninglessness was more meaninglessness. By maintaining his moral code even in the face of the Joker's escalating provocations, Batman was asserting that meaning could be created and maintained through conscious choice. That order was not an illusion, but an achievement. The Joker's response to this moral steadfastness was to escalate his provocations systematically, testing the limits of Batman's restraint while searching for the breaking point that would validate his nihilistic philosophy. Each crime became both an end in itself and a move in a larger psychological chess game, designed to demonstrate that Batman's moral code was ultimately arbitrary and that sufficient pressure would eventually reveal its fundamental weakness. The success of the Joker's 5-way revenge led to the unprecedented step of giving the character his own solo comic series in 1975, making him the first major comic book villain to headline his own ongoing title. This development represented more than mere commercial exploitation of a popular character. It was recognition that the Joker had evolved into something that transcended the traditional hero-villain dynamic to become a compelling protagonist in his own right. The solo series allowed for exploration of the character's psychology and methodology in ways that had been impossible when he appeared only as Batman's antagonist. Stories could focus on the Joker's planning process, his recruitment and management of henchmen, his interactions with other criminals, and his own internal monologue as he developed increasingly elaborate schemes. The result was a character study that revealed layers of complexity that had only been hinted at in his previous appearances. The series also established the Joker as a criminal who operated on a national and eventually international scale. No longer confined to Gotham City, he began staging elaborate crimes across the country, each one themed around different aspects of American culture and society. His robbery of a comedy club in Las Vegas became an elaborate performance piece about the commodification of humor. His infiltration of a television studio resulted in a live broadcast that forced the entire viewing audience to participate in his philosophical demonstration about the arbitrary nature of social convention. The Laughing Fish storyline, which appeared both in the solo series and in Detective Comics, represented the full flowering of the Bronze Age Joker's approach to criminal enterprise. The plot involving the Joker's attempt to trademark fish that had been chemically altered to bear his distinctive grin seemed absurd on its surface, but revealed deeper insights into his character and worldview. This wasn't merely another elaborate prank, but a serious attempt to commercialize his image and establish legal ownership of his brand of chaos. The genius of the Laughing Fish concept lay in its combination of surreal logic with genuine threat. The Joker's insistence that he could trademark naturally occurring fish because he had altered their appearance represented a kind of twisted legal reasoning that was simultaneously completely illogical and disturbingly plausible. His willingness to murder patent officials who refused to process his application demonstrated that he was entirely serious about his apparently ridiculous scheme. The story also showcased the Joker's evolution into a multimedia criminal who understood that modern crime required sophisticated understanding of law, commerce, and publicity. His appearance on television to promote his fish products, complete with jingle and advertising slogan, represented the full integration of his theatrical nature with practical criminal objectives. He had learned to weaponize the tools of mass communication, transforming entertainment media into vehicles for psychological terrorism. The psychological profile that emerged from these Bronze Age stories revealed a character who had moved far beyond simple insanity into something that might be called metasanitia, state of consciousness that acknowledged the arbitrary nature of conventional moral categories, while remaining functionally capable of operating within society's structures when it served his purposes. The Joker wasn't incapable of understanding right and wrong. He simply rejected these categories as meaningless constructs that serve to obscure the true nature of existence. This philosophical sophistication made him far more dangerous than conventional criminals or even traditional comic book villains. Where other antagonists might be motivated by greed, revenge, or simple malice, the Joker was motivated by the desire to demonstrate the truth of his worldview through practical application. Each crime was simultaneously a criminal act and a philosophical argument, each victim both a target and a test case for his theories about human nature and social organization. The Bronze Age also saw the development of the Joker's relationship with other criminals in Gotham's rogues gallery. Unlike other villains who formed alliances based on mutual benefit or shared objectives, the Joker's collaborations were always temporary and usually ended in betrayal or violence. This wasn't mere antisocial behavior, but reflected his fundamental belief that all human relationships were ultimately exploitative, and that acknowledging this fact openly was more honest than maintaining the pretense of genuine cooperation. His interactions with figures like the Penguin, Two-Face, and the Riddler revealed different aspects of his character and philosophy. Where the Penguin represented conventional criminal ambition dressed up in theatrical trappings, the Joker embodied chaos that had transcended any practical objective. Where Two-Face was driven by psychological compulsion, the Joker had achieved a kind of freedom through the complete rejection of psychological consistency. Where the Riddler was motivated by the need to prove his intellectual superiority, the Joker was motivated by the desire to demonstrate that intelligence itself was ultimately meaningless. The visual presentation of the character continued to evolve during this period, reflecting his transition from prankster back to predator while maintaining the theatrical sophistication he had developed during the Silver Age. His costume remained the classic purple suit, but its cut became more contemporary and somehow more menacing. His chalk-white complexion took on new dimensions of horror, suggesting not merely chemical alteration but fundamental transformation into something that existed outside normal biological categories. Most significantly, His smile evolved from the broad, almost cartoonish grin of the Silver Age into something more subtle and infinitely more disturbing. This was no longer the expression of someone who found life amusing, but rather the fixed rictus of someone who had seen through the illusions that made life bearable for others. It was the smile of someone who had embraced despair so completely that it had transformed into a kind of terrible joy. The Bronze Age transformation of the Joker represented more than mere character development. It was a fundamental redefinition of what comic book villainy could accomplish as a storytelling medium. By combining the theatrical flair of his Silver Age incarnation with the lethal purpose of his Golden Age origins, the character had evolved into something that transcended traditional genre boundaries to become a figure capable of carrying serious philosophical and psychological themes while remaining accessible to popular audiences. The stage was now set for the next phase of his evolution, one that would push the character and the medium itself into territory that had previously been considered off-limits for mainstream comic books. The Joker had learned to weaponize absurdity, to philosophize through murder, and to transform entertainment into terrorism. He was ready to test the ultimate boundaries of his relationship with Batman, and to demonstrate once and for all that his worldview was not merely a theoretical position, but a practical program for the complete destruction of everything that made civilization possible. All it takes is one bad day, he would soon insist, and he was eager to prove it. One bad day? The Killing Joke. The year 1988 would prove to be a watershed moment, not just in the evolution of the Joker as a character, but in the fundamental understanding of what comic books could achieve as a storytelling medium. Into this pivotal year came a single graphic novel that would redefine the relationship between hero and villain, between sanity and madness, between tragedy and comedy, and between the comfortable moral certainties of superhero fiction and the brutal ambiguities of real human psychology. Batman, The Killing Joke, crafted by the legendary Alan Moore with Brian Bolland's haunting artwork, represented nothing less than the complete deconstruction and reconstruction of the Joker mythos, transforming him from comic book villain into something approaching genuine mythological figure. The genius of Moore's approach lay not in providing definitive answers about the Joker's origins, but in demonstrating why such answers were ultimately irrelevant to understanding the character's true significance. The famous opening line, "I remember it differently each time," established immediately that this would not be another attempt to pin down the Joker's background with conventional biographical details, but rather an exploration of how trauma and memory interact to create the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we became what we've become. The origin story that Moore provided the failed comedian, the pregnant wife, the chemical plant accident was presented explicitly as unreliable narrative, possibly true, possibly false, possibly a mixture of both. The failed comedian who agreed to guide criminals through the Ace chemical plant while wearing the red hood that would eventually become associated with his transformation was simultaneously a fully realized character and a deliberate archetype, representing every person who had ever faced the choice between moral compromise and personal destruction. The psychological portrait that emerged from this origin was devastating in its implications. Here was not a man who had been born evil or who had chosen evil from a position of strength, but someone who had been systematically broken down by circumstances until evil seemed like the only rational response to an irrational universe. The death of his pregnant wife in a household accident, the failure of his comedy career, the economic desperation that drove him to crime each element was carefully calibrated to demonstrate how ordinary human weaknesses could cascade into extraordinary human monsters. But the true brilliance of the story lay not in the origin itself, but in its juxtaposition with the contemporary narrative involving Commissioner Gordon and his daughter Barbara. The Joker's assault on the Gordon family wasn't merely another criminal scheme, but a deliberate experiment designed to test his fundamental thesis about human nature, that anyone could be driven to madness by sufficient trauma, that the difference between sanity and insanity was merely a matter of circumstance rather than character. The shooting of Barbara Gordon represented a moment of genuine shock in comic book history, not merely because of its violence, but because of its deliberate targeting of a character who had been established as both heroic in her own right as Batgirl and innocent of any direct involvement in the Batman-Joker conflict. This wasn't collateral damage in a larger battle, but calculated cruelty designed to maximize psychological impact on both Commissioner Gordon and Batman himself. The Joker's subsequent treatment of Commissioner Gordon, stripping him naked, caging him like an animal, forcing him to view photographs of his wounded daughter, represented the character's evolution into something that transcended traditional villainy, to become a genuine force of psychological terrorism. This wasn't mere sadism but applied philosophy, a practical demonstration of the Joker's belief that civilization was nothing more than a thin veneer that could be stripped away by the right application of trauma and humiliation. The photographs themselves became iconic symbols of the Joker's methodology, representing his understanding that, in the modern world, the documentation of suffering was often more powerful than the suffering itself. By forcing Gordon to view images of his daughter's assault, the Joker was demonstrating that trauma could be replicated and amplified through representation, that the initial crime was merely the beginning of a process that could extend indefinitely through memory and media. The carnival setting that Moore chose for Gordon's torment was perfect in its symbolic appropriateness. Here was an environment dedicated to controlled chaos, to the safe simulation of danger and excitement, transformed into a genuine chamber of horrors. The funhouse mirrors that distorted Gordon's reflection served as literal manifestations of the Joker's belief that identity itself was malleable, that the self was nothing more than a collection of perceptions that could be manipulated and transformed through the right application of pressure. The philosophical core of the story, the Joker's insistence that all it takes is one bad day to transform a normal person into a monster like himself, represented the most sophisticated articulation of his worldview that had yet appeared in comic form. This wasn't mere criminal rationalization, but a genuinely disturbing insight into the nature of human psychology and the arbitrary factors that separate the sane from the insane, the moral from the immoral, the heroic from the monstrous. Batman's response to this philosophy became crucial to understanding the fundamental dynamic between the two characters. Where the Joker saw his own transformation as proof that everyone was ultimately corruptible, Batman represented the opposing view that people could choose to respond to trauma with purpose rather than chaos, with construction rather than destruction, with meaning-making rather than meaning-destruction. The Dark Knight's own origin story served as a direct refutation of the Joker's thesis, demonstrating that the same kind of traumatic loss that had supposedly created the Joker had instead created someone dedicated to preventing others from experiencing similar trauma. The climactic confrontation between Batman and the Joker in the abandoned amusement park represented more than mere physical conflict. It was a battle between two incompatible philosophies of existence, two different responses to the fundamental absurdity and cruelty of life. The Joker's offer to Batman that they could end their conflict by acknowledging their mutual madness and killing each other represented the ultimate expression of his nihilistic worldview, the suggestion that their entire relationship was nothing more than an elaborate form of mutual suicide. Batman's rejection of this offer, his insistence on maintaining hope for the Joker's eventual rehabilitation, represented more than mere heroic optimism. It was a fundamental assertion that meaning could be created and maintained, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. By refusing to kill the Joker, or to accept the Joker's characterization of their relationship as mutually destructive, Batman was asserting that choice remained possible even for those who claimed to have moved beyond the possibility of choice. The famous final scene, Batman's attempt to reach the Joker through humor, the shared laughter over the joke about the two lunatics, and the flashlight beam, represented perhaps the most complex and controversial ending in comic book history. The ambiguity of this conclusion, which could be read as either genuine breakthrough or final breakdown, reflected Moore's refusal to provide easy answers to the profound questions that the story had raised. The joke itself about one lunatic trying to help another escape an asylum by shining a flashlight beam for him to walk across, only to be told, "You must think I'm crazy. You'd turn it off when I was halfway across," served as a perfect metaphor for the entire Batman-Joker relationship. Here were two figures trapped in their respective forms of madness, each offering the other forms of help that the other could never accept, each convinced that the other was the truly insane one. The lasting impact of The Killing Joke extended far beyond its immediate narrative to fundamentally alter how comic books could approach serious themes and adult subject matter. The story demonstrated that superhero comics could handle philosophical complexity, psychological realism, and moral ambiguity without losing their essential mythic power. It proved that characters who had been created for children's entertainment could evolve to address the deepest concerns of adult readers while remaining accessible to popular audiences. The controversy surrounding Barbara Gordon's treatment in the story also sparked important discussions about the representation of violence against women in comic books and the responsibilities of creators when dealing with established characters who had significant fan followings. These debates would influence comic book storytelling for decades to come, leading to more thoughtful consideration of how violence was portrayed and what purposes it served in superhero narratives. The story's exploration of memory, identity, and trauma anticipated many of the themes that would dominate not just comic books but popular culture more broadly in the decades that followed. The Joker's unreliable narration, his multiple possible origins, his insistence that identity was fluid and changeable, all of these elements reflected a growing cultural awareness that traditional concepts of fixed identity and linear narrative were inadequate to capture the complexity of modern psychological experience. Most significantly, The Killing Joke established the template for what would become known as mature superhero comic stories that maintained the mythic scope and archetypal power of traditional superhero fiction while addressing themes and employing techniques that had previously been associated only with literary fiction. The success of this approach would influence countless creators and lead to an entire renaissance in superhero storytelling during the following decades. The transformation of the Joker from comic book villain to cultural icon was largely completed with this single story. Here was a character who could serve simultaneously as entertainment and philosophical statement, as pop culture phenomenon and serious artistic creation, as mythological figure and psychological case study. The ambiguity that Moore built into the character, the uncertainty about his origins, the complexity of his motivations, the disturbing plausibility of his worldview made him infinitely more compelling than any definitive characterization could have achieved. The story also cemented the symbiotic nature of the Batman-Joker relationship in ways that would influence every subsequent interpretation of both characters. They were no longer simply hero and villain, but complementary aspects of a single psychological exploration. Two different responses to trauma and chaos that defined each other through their opposition. Neither could exist without the other. Neither could be fully understood without reference to their eternal conflict. As the story concluded with that ambiguous shared laughter, the stage was set for the next phase of the Joker's evolution. He had been established as a figure capable of genuine philosophical depth, psychological complexity, and cultural significance that extended far beyond the boundaries of comic book fiction. The groundwork had been laid for even more extreme explorations of his character and methodology, for stories that would push the boundaries of what superhero comics could accomplish as serious artistic medium. If tragedy makes monsters, what does vengeance make? Death in the Family. The Murder of Jason Todd. The sound of metal striking flesh echoes through the annals of comic book history with a resonance that few moments in the medium have ever achieved. 26 strikes of a crowbar against the broken body of 15-year-old Jason Todd, each blow carefully counted by readers who followed the story in real time, each impact reverberating through the DC universe and beyond into the collective consciousness of popular culture itself. The death of the second Robin at the hands of the Joker represented more than mere shocking plot development. It was a fundamental transformation in the nature of superhero storytelling, a crossing of a line that could never be uncrossed, a demonstration that even the most sacred conventions of the genre were not immune to violation. The year was 1988, the same watershed year that had given birth to The Killing Joke, and the confluence of these two stories created a perfect storm of psychological complexity and narrative innovation that would forever alter how both Batman and the Joker were understood as characters. Where The Killing Joke had explored the theoretical possibilities of the Joker's philosophy through his assault on the Gordon family, A Death in the Family would test those theories through their practical application to the heart of Batman's surrogate family structure. The genesis of Jason Todd's death lay not in the creative minds of the story's architects, but in the democratic process of reader participation. DC Comics' decision to allow readers to vote on whether Jason Todd would survive the Joker's assault represented an unprecedented experiment in interactive storytelling, one that blurred the traditional boundaries between creator and audience, between narrative authority and popular democracy. The fact that the readers chose death by the narrow margin of 343 votes against survival versus 271 votes for it added layers of meaning to the story that no single creative decision could have achieved. This democratic element transformed the story from simple fictional narrative into cultural event, making every reader who participated in the vote complicit in Jason's death. The Joker hadn't merely killed Robin, he had manipulated the entire readership into becoming accessories to murder, demonstrating that his capacity for corruption extended beyond the fictional world into the realm of actual human moral choice. It was perhaps the most sophisticated example of the Joker's philosophy made manifest in the real world, proving that given the right circumstances, ordinary people could be induced to choose cruelty over compassion. The story itself unfolded with the inexorable logic of classical tragedy, each scene building toward the inevitable climax while maintaining the hope that somehow, despite the democratic verdict, Jason would find a way to survive. The Joker's scheme selling weapons to both sides in a Middle Eastern conflict, while simultaneously working with international terrorists, represented the character's evolution into a global threat whose reach extended far beyond Gotham's borders. This wasn't merely another elaborate prank or local criminal enterprise, but an operation that demonstrated his understanding of geopolitical complexity and his willingness to profit from human suffering on a massive scale. Jason's own character development throughout the storyline revealed the psychological damage that years of crime fighting had inflicted on someone too young to process the moral complexities involved. Unlike Dick Grayson, who had possessed the emotional maturity and acrobatic background necessary to thrive as Robin, Jason brought to the role an anger and recklessness that made him increasingly unsuitable for the partnership that Batman required. His growing willingness to use excessive force, his disregard for Batman's strategic planning, his tendency to let personal emotions override tactical considerations, all of these factors contributed to the chain of events that would ultimately lead to his capture by the Joker. The psychological portrait of Batman throughout the story revealed the extent to which his identity as a father figure had become central to his conception of himself as both hero and man. The search for Jason's biological mother, which served as the ostensible plot driver for the international adventure, was really a search for understanding of what family meant in the context of Batman's mission. Bruce Wayne's relationship with Jason represented his attempt to create genuine human connection within the framework of his war on crime, to demonstrate that his crusade was about more than mere vengeance, but about protection and nurturing of innocence. The Joker's recognition of this psychological vulnerability demonstrated his evolution into something approaching a psychoanalyst of heroism, someone who understood not just Batman's tactical methods but his deepest emotional needs and fears. The targeting of Jason wasn't random violence but calculated psychological warfare, designed to strike at the very foundations of Batman's identity as protector and father figure. By killing Robin, the Joker wasn't just eliminating an opponent, was proving that Batman's attempts to create meaning and family through his crime-fighting activities were ultimately futile. The warehouse scene where Jason met his fate became one of the most iconic and disturbing sequences in comic book history. The Joker's methodical brutality, his casual conversation with his victim between blows, his obvious pleasure in both the physical violence and the psychological tormental of these elements combined to create a portrait of evil that transcended conventional comic book villainy to become something genuinely horrifying. This wasn't the theatrical prankster of the Silver Age or even the philosophical terrorist of The Killing Joke. This was a predator who had discovered that the ultimate joke was the complete destruction of innocence, hope. The crowbar itself became a symbol whose power extended far beyond its practical function as weapon. In the Joker's hands, this ordinary construction tool was transformed into an instrument of philosophical statement, each blow representing his rejection of the values that Jason embodied: youth, hope, the possibility of redemption, the belief that good could triumph over evil through courage and determination. The Joker wasn't simply killing a person, he was systematically destroying an entire worldview, demonstrating through practical application that innocence was not a protection against evil, but rather a vulnerability that evil could exploit. The explosion that followed the beating served multiple narrative functions. On the practical level, it eliminated any possibility of last-minute rescue, ensuring that Jason's death would be absolute and irreversible. On the symbolic level, it represented the complete destruction of the safe space that the warehouse had temporarily provided, the obliteration of any refuge from the consequences of the violent world that Jason had chosen to enter. Most significantly, it served as the Joker's signature on his masterpiece of destruction, his way of ensuring that his message would be delivered with maximum impact. Batman's discovery of the aftermath represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating moment in the character's long history. Here was the Dark Knight, master detective and tactical genius, reduced to cradling the broken body of his surrogate son, while confronting the complete failure of his ability to protect those he cared about most. The scene inverted all of the traditional power dynamics of superhero fiction. The hero was helpless, the villain had triumphed completely, and the innocent had paid the ultimate price for the adult world's moral failures. The aftermath of Jason's death reverberated through the entire Batman mythology in ways that are still being explored decades later. Batman's guilt over his failure to save Jason manifested in increasingly obsessive and violent behavior, his methods becoming more brutal, and his relationships with allies becoming more distant and controlling. The Joker had succeeded in transforming Batman into something closer to his own nihilistic worldview, demonstrating that corruption could be achieved not just through direct assault on moral principles, but through the systematic destruction of everything that made those principles meaningful. The diplomatic immunity subplot that followed Jason's death added another layer of complexity to the Joker's methodology and worldview. His appointment as Iranian ambassador to the United Nations wasn't merely an escape mechanism, but a sophisticated commentary on the arbitrary nature of international law and diplomatic protocol. Here was a mass murderer being granted legal protection by the same international community that claimed to uphold justice and human rights. A practical demonstration of the Joker's thesis that all human institutions were ultimately meaningless constructs that could be manipulated by anyone clever enough to understand their fundamental absurdity. The assassination attempt on the Joker during his speech to the United Nations General Assembly represented the international community's recognition that some evils transcended diplomatic niceties, but it also demonstrated the Joker's ability to manipulate global politics for his own entertainment. His survival of the attack and subsequent return to criminal activity proved that even the combined resources of the world's nations were insufficient to contain the chaos that he represented. The long-term psychological impact on Batman would influence every subsequent interpretation of the character. The empty display case in the Batcave, with Jason's Robin costume serving as a permanent memorial and reminder of failure, became a shrine to the limitations of heroism and the price of idealism in a world that didn't always reward good intentions. Every subsequent Robin would be measured against Jason's memory. Every mission would carry the weight of potential loss, and every confrontation with the Joker would be colored by the knowledge of what the Clown Prince of Crime was truly capable of achieving. The story also established the template for what would become known as event comics, storylines that promised permanent changes to major characters and delivered on those promises through irreversible consequences. The death of Jason Todd proved that even the most established conventions of superhero fiction, the safety of sidekicks, the ultimate triumph of good over evil, the protection of innocence through heroic intervention, were not immune to violation when the story demanded it. The cultural impact extended far beyond comic book readership to influence broader discussions about violence in entertainment, parental responsibility, and the psychological effects of media consumption on young audiences. The fact that readers had voted for Jason's death raised disturbing questions about the relationship between fiction and reality, about the extent to which audiences could be complicit in fictional violence, and about the responsibilities of creators when dealing with subject matter that might influence real-world behavior. The resurrection of Jason Todd years later as the Red Hood would add yet another layer of complexity to the story's meaning, transforming it from simple tragedy into exploration of trauma, redemption, and the long-term consequences of violence. The revelation that Jason had returned from the dead filled with rage and armed with a willingness to kill criminals that Batman lacked would complete the circle of the Joker's corruption, demonstrating that even death could not protect innocence from his influence. But in 1988, as readers absorbed the shock of Robin's death and Batman confronted the complete failure of his protective instincts, the Joker had achieved something unprecedented in comic book villainy. He had proven that his philosophy wasn't merely theoretical construct but practical program, that chaos could triumph over order not through superior force, but through superior understanding of human psychology and institutional weakness. He had demonstrated that the most effective way to destroy a hero wasn't to kill him, but to make him live with the knowledge of his own failure to protect those who depended on him. The crowbar, stained with the blood of innocence, became the Joker's most powerful symbol, not just of his capacity for violence, but of his ability to transform ordinary objects into instruments of philosophical statement. Every subsequent appearance of the weapon in Batman's stories would carry the weight of Jason's memory, serving as a reminder that the Joker's true power lay not in his unpredictability or his theatrical flair, but in his absolute commitment to proving that hope itself was the cruelest joke of all. Arkham is not a hospital, it's a stage, and the star never leaves for long. Arkham, Obsession Joker, Batman Codependency. In the Gothic halls of Arkham Asylum, where the boundaries between sanity and madness blur like watercolors in rain, there exists a relationship so complex and psychologically intricate that it defies conventional categories of heroism and villainy, love and hate, salvation and damnation. The asylum itself, with its towering spires and labyrinthine corridors, serves not merely as a containment facility for Gotham's most dangerous criminals, but as a physical manifestation of the psychological space where Batman and the Joker conduct their eternal dance of mutual obsession and codependent destruction. The publication of Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, in 1989, crafted by Grant Morrison with Dave McKean's nightmarish artwork, represented a quantum leap forward in the psychological sophistication of superhero storytelling. Here was a work that treated the asylum not as mere backdrop for superhero adventure, but as a living symbol of the collective unconscious, a place where the repressed fears and desires of an entire city had taken physical form and demanded confrontation from those brave or foolish enough to enter its domain. Morrison's vision of Arkham transformed it from simple prison into therapeutic theater, a space where the normal rules of reality were suspended in favor of deeper psychological truths. The inmates weren't merely contained within its walls, they were participants in an ongoing group therapy session that had been running for decades, with Batman serving simultaneously as patient, therapist, and subject of analysis. The Joker, naturally, occupied the role of star performer, the patient whose insights into the nature of madness made him simultaneously the most dangerous and most perceptive resident of the institution. The psychological profile that emerged from Morrison's exploration revealed the Joker as something far more complex than simple madman or criminal mastermind. Here was a figure who existed in a state of what might be called supersanity, a condition that allowed him to perceive reality with a clarity that normal human consciousness could not achieve or survive. His apparent madness wasn't the result of psychological breakdown, but of psychological breakthrough, the achievement of a state of awareness that recognized the arbitrary nature of all human constructs and chose to embrace that arbitrariness as a form of liberation. This concept of supersanity provided a new framework for understanding the Joker's relationship with Batman and with reality itself. Where normal individuals were trapped within the limitations of consistent personality and logical behavior, the Joker had achieved a form of consciousness that allowed him to reinvent himself moment by moment, to become whatever the situation required without being constrained by previous versions of his identity. He was simultaneously every possible version of himself, and none of them, a quantum personality that existed in a state of permanent flux. Batman's inability to cure or permanently contain the Joker took on new meaning within this psychological framework. The Dark Knight wasn't simply dealing with a criminal who possessed superior escape skills or legal loopholes. She was confronting a fundamental challenge to his own understanding of identity, purpose, and the possibility of redemption. The Joker represented everything that Batman had rejected in his own response to trauma, the path not taken that constantly called into question the validity of the path that had been chosen. The asylum's architecture, as reimagined by Morrison and McKean, became a physical manifestation of this psychological complexity. The building itself seemed to shift and change according to the mental states of its inhabitants, corridors extending or contracting based on the fears and desires of those who walked them. The famous scene where Batman is forced to play a twisted game of tarot with the Joker, using cards that depicted the major archetypes of their shared mythology, represented the ultimate expression of their relationship as psychological rather than merely physical confrontation. The tarot sequence revealed the extent to which both characters had become trapped within mythological roles that neither could abandon without losing their essential identity. Batman was forever the Knight of Swords, the figure of justice whose righteousness contained its own form of madness. The Joker was eternally the fool, the figure whose apparent simplicity masked profound wisdom about the nature of existence. Neither could exist without the other. Each defined himself through opposition to what the other represented. The concept of codependency that Morrison explored through the Asylum's therapeutic framework provided new insights into why Batman's repeated capture and release of the Joker followed such predictable patterns. This wasn't merely the result of an inadequate justice system or the Joker's superior escape skill set. Was the behavioral pattern of two individuals locked in a relationship that neither could end because ending it would require fundamental changes to their core identities that neither was prepared to make. Batman's refusal to kill the Joker, viewed through this psychological lens, became less about moral principle and more about psychological necessity. To kill the Joker would be to eliminate the external manifestation of everything that Batman feared about himself. The possibility that his own response to trauma was as arbitrary and potentially destructive as the Joker's, that the only difference between hero and villain was the accidents of circumstance and choice that could be altered by sufficient pressure. The Joker's parallel refusal to permanently destroy Batman revealed similar psychological dependencies. Without Batman to serve as audience, straight man, and moral contrast, the Joker's performance would lose its meaning, and his jokes would fall flat. He needed Batman not just as opponent but as collaborator in the ongoing theater of their relationship, the only person who truly understood the rules of the game they were playing and could appreciate the sophistication of the moves being made. The therapeutic sessions depicted in Morrison's vision of Arkham revealed the extent to which the Joker had become a philosophical counselor to the other inmates, someone whose insights into the nature of madness made him paradoxically the sanest person in the institution. His ability to perceive the arbitrary nature of the categories that separated normal from abnormal, legal from illegal, moral from immoral, gave him a form of wisdom that traditional psychiatry could neither understand nor effectively treat. Dr. Amadeus Arkham's own descent into madness, as revealed through the asylum's historical records, provided a template for understanding how good intentions could be corrupted through prolonged exposure to the kind of evil that the Joker represented. The founder of the institution had begun with genuine desire to help the mentally ill, but had gradually been transformed by his attempts to understand and treat conditions that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional psychology. The revelation that Arkham himself had eventually become indistinguishable from his patients suggested that prolonged engagement with the Joker's philosophy carried inherent risks that extended beyond simple physical danger. The Clown Prince of Crime possessed a form of intellectual contagion, ability to introduce doubt and uncertainty into even the most stable personalities through the simple expedient of forcing them to examine the foundations of their beliefs and finding those foundations wanting. The Man Who Laughs, Ed Brubaker's 2005 retelling of the first Batman-Joker encounter, added another layer to this psychological complexity by exploring how their initial meeting had established patterns that would define every subsequent interaction. The story revealed that the Joker had recognized something in Batman during their first confrontation, not just an opponent worth engaging, but a kindred spirit who had responded to trauma with equal extremity, albeit channeled in a different direction. The concept of the "we'll kill each other" prophecy that emerged from these psychological explorations became a central element in understanding their relationship. This wasn't merely dramatic exaggeration, but psychological recognition of the fact that their identities had become so intertwined that the death of one would inevitably lead to the fundamental transformation or destruction of the other. They were locked in a form of psychological symbiosis that transcended normal categories of enmity or opposition. The Joker's claim that Batman had created him became more than mere villain's rationalization when viewed through this psychological framework. In a very real sense, Batman's presence in Gotham had created the conditions that allowed the Joker's particular form of madness to flourish and find expression. Without the moral certainty that Batman represented, the Joker's nihilistic philosophy would lack the contrast necessary to give it meaning and impact. Similarly, Batman's counterclaim that the Joker had created him revealed the extent to which the Dark Knight's identity had been shaped by the need to respond to the kind of chaos that the Joker represented. Without the Joker to serve as ultimate embodiment of everything that Batman opposed, the Dark Knight's mission would lack the existential urgency that gave it meaning and purpose. The Asylum's function as therapeutic theater allowed for exploration of these psychological dynamics in ways that traditional superhero storytelling could not accommodate. Here was a space where normal rules were suspended, where conversations could occur that would be impossible in the outside world, where the deepest truths about both characters could be revealed through their interactions with the physical and symbolic space of madness itself. The recurring motif of games chess, cards, riddles, elaborate death traps that characterized their encounters within Arkham's walls reflected the extent to which their relationship had evolved beyond simple conflict into something approaching collaborative art. Each confrontation was simultaneously genuine battle and elaborate performance, with both participants playing roles that they had perfected over years of repetition while constantly searching for variations that might break the stalemate that defined their relationship. The psychological complexity that Morrison and subsequent writers brought to the Batman-Joker dynamic influenced an entire generation of superhero storytelling, demonstrating that characters created for children's entertainment could be developed to address the deepest questions of human psychology and moral philosophy without losing their essential mythic power. The Asylum became a laboratory for exploring the darkest territories of the human psyche through the medium of popular fiction. The influence of this psychological sophistication extended beyond comic books to encompass film, television, and literary fiction that dealt with similar themes of moral ambiguity and psychological complexity. The idea that heroes and villains might be trapped in codependent relationships that neither could end without losing their essential identity became a recurring theme in popular culture, one that reflected growing awareness of the complexity of human motivation and the inadequacy of simple moral categories. Most significantly, the exploration of Arkham as therapeutic space established the template for understanding superhero comics as a form of modern mythology capable of addressing the deepest concerns of contemporary life. The Asylum wasn't merely a setting for adventure stories, but a sacred space where the eternal questions of human existence could be explored through the interaction of archetypal figures who embodied different responses to the fundamental challenges of consciousness and mortality. As Batman and the Joker continued their eternal dance through the halls of Arkham, their relationship evolved from simple opposition into something approaching mutual recognition of their shared isolation from normal human categories. They were the only individuals who truly understood each other, the only ones who could appreciate the full complexity of the game they were playing and the stakes involved in its continuation. The 1990s turned the volume upon consequences. The war of jokes and riddles. In the labyrinthine mythology of Batman's early career, few conflicts have proven as philosophically complex or psychologically revealing as the war of jokes and riddles, a brutal campaign that transformed Gotham City into a battlefield where two of its most intellectually sophisticated criminals waged proxy warfare through hired assassins and elaborate schemes, while Batman, still learning the rules of his own heroic identity, found himself caught between opposing forces that each represented different aspects of the chaos he had sworn to combat. Tom King's masterful exploration of this early career conflict, told through the framing device of Batman's confession to Catwoman on the night before their wedding, elevated what could have been a simple villain team-up story into something approaching tragic literature. The revelation that this war had been one of Batman's greatest failures, a conflict whose resolution had required him to compromise his moral principles in ways that would haunt him for decades, added layers of psychological complexity that transformed understanding of the Dark Knight's character development and the prices he had paid for his eventual effectiveness as Gotham's protector. The central premise that the Joker had lost his ability to find anything funny, while the Riddler had become obsessed with an unsolvable riddle, created a fascinating inversion of their traditional roles and motivations. Here was the Joker, traditionally the embodiment of chaotic humor, reduced to going through the motions of comedy without experiencing any of its psychological rewards. Meanwhile, the Riddler, usually driven by intellectual pride and the need to demonstrate superiority through puzzles, had encountered a question that defied his analytical capabilities and had become consumed by the need to solve it regardless of cost. The riddle that tormented Edward Nygma throughout the conflict, "What do you do when you're not the smartest person in the room?" operated on multiple levels of meaning and significance. On the surface, it represented his discovery that Batman's detective skills exceeded his own, a revelation that shattered his self-conception as Gotham's premier intellectual criminal. More profoundly, it reflected his recognition that intelligence alone was insufficient to impose order on a universe that seemed designed to frustrate rational understanding and logical planning. The Joker's parallel crises, inability to laugh or find humor in situations that would previously have delighted him, represented an even more fundamental disruption of identity and purpose. For a character whose entire existence was built around the philosophy that life was meaningless and the only rational response was laughter, the loss of that laughter represented something approaching spiritual death. He continued to commit crimes and construct elaborate scenarios, but they had become mechanical exercises devoid of the joy and spontaneity that had previously defined his approach to chaos. This psychological crisis transformed the Joker from agent of chaos into something more disturbing a figure, going through the motions of his established role, while feeling none of the passion that had originally motivated him. His crimes during this period possessed all the theatrical complexity of his previous work but lacked the essential element of genuine amusement that had made them effective as both criminal enterprises and philosophical statements. The war itself began over the seemingly trivial matter of which villain would be allowed to kill Batman first, but quickly escalated into a citywide conflict that divided Gotham's criminal underworld into opposing camps. The Joker's recruitment of killers like Deathstroke, Deadshot, and Victor Zsasz created an army of assassins whose methods were as varied as they were lethal. The Riddler's counter-recruitment of figures like Poison Ivy, Mr. Freeze, and the Mad Hatter created an opposing force that relied more on elaborate traps and intellectual challenges than direct violence. The genius of King's approach lay in his recognition that this conflict would inevitably draw in innocent civilians who had no stake in the philosophical differences between the two criminal masterminds, but would suffer the consequences of their proxy war nonetheless. The story of Kite Man Charles Brown, whose son died as collateral damage in one of the Riddler's schemes, provided human scale and emotional weight to what could have been merely an intellectual exercise in criminal psychology. The transformation of Charles Brown from ordinary citizen to costumed criminal represented one of the war's most tragic casualties and most profound statements about the nature of victimization and response to trauma. His adoption of the Kite Man persona wasn't driven by the same philosophical concerns that motivated the Joker and Riddler, nor by the moral mission that defined Batman, but by simple need to find meaning and agency in a world that had demonstrated its complete indifference to his family's welfare. Batman's position throughout the conflict revealed the extent to which his early career limitations made him inadequate to address the kind of systemic chaos that the war represented. His usual methods, detective work, individual confrontation, moral example, were insufficient to stop a conflict that had transformed the entire city into a battleground where every citizen was a potential casualty and every location was a potential target. The psychological portrait of the young Batman that emerged from this storyline showed a hero still learning the practical applications of his moral principles and discovering that good intentions were insufficient to prevent tragedy when faced with enemies who operated according to completely different logical frameworks. His growing frustration and desperation as the war escalated beyond his ability to control represented crucial character development that explained elements of his later methodology and psychological makeup. The revelation that Batman had ultimately ended the war by threatening to kill the Riddler, a violation of his no-kill rule that remained theoretical rather than actual, but nonetheless represented a fundamental compromise of his moral principles, provided new understanding of how his absolute moral code had been tested and refined through practical experience. The fact that this threat had been effective demonstrated both the power of his moral reputation and the psychological costs of maintaining it under extreme circumstances. The Joker's reaction to witnessing Batman's moral compromise, his sudden return to laughter and apparent joy at seeing the Dark Knight forced to consider murder, revealed the extent to which his psychological crisis had been connected to his relationship with Batman specifically. The loss of his ability to laugh hadn't been random psychological breakdown but response to Batman's moral certainty, which had made his own philosophy of meaninglessness seem less compelling and entertaining. The restoration of the Joker's laughter through Batman's moral crisis created a disturbing symbiosis that explained elements of their future relationship and the Joker's continued obsession with testing Batman's moral boundaries. He had learned that Batman's righteousness wasn't invulnerable to pressure and that sufficient escalation could force even the most morally certain individuals to compromise their principles. The Riddlers faded defeated not through superior intellect, but through Batman's willingness to abandon intellectual competition in favor of direct threat, represented a different kind of philosophical resolution. His riddle had been answered not through logical analysis, but through demonstration that some problems required action rather than understanding, that intelligence without moral framework was insufficient to impose order on chaotic situations. The broader implications of the war extended beyond its immediate participants to encompass questions about the nature of heroism, the responsibilities of power, and the prices that individuals paid for maintaining moral principles in immoral environments. Batman's confession to Selina revealed the extent to which his early experiences had shaped his understanding of what heroism required and what costs it imposed on those who chose to pursue it. The framing device of Batman's pre-wedding confession added layers of meaning about truth, intimacy, and the ways that past traumas influenced present relationships. His decision to reveal this failure to Catwoman represented recognition that genuine intimacy required acknowledgement of moral complexity and psychological vulnerability. That love meant accepting the full truth of another person's character, rather than idealized versions of who they might be. The artistic achievement of Mikel Janin's visual storytelling, particularly in depicting the escalating violence and psychological strain of the extended conflict, created new visual vocabulary for representing the kind of large-scale urban warfare that the storyline described. The images of Gotham transformed into battleground, of ordinary citizens caught between opposing criminal forces, of Batman struggling to maintain moral clarity while surrounded by systemic chaos, provided powerful commentary on the realities of vigilante justice and its limitations. The influence of this storyline on subsequent Batman stories was significant, establishing new understanding of how the character's moral code had been developed and tested through practical experience rather than abstract philosophical consideration. The revelation that even Batman had been forced to consider compromise added psychological complexity that made his later moral certainty more meaningful and hard-won. The exploration of how trauma could create both heroes and villains, often from the same circumstances, provided sophisticated analysis of the factors that determined individual responses to suffering and injustice. The contrast between Batman's transformation of trauma into mission, the Joker's transformation of trauma into philosophy, and Kite Man's transformation of trauma into identity revealed the arbitrary nature of how individuals processed and responded to life-changing events. Most significantly, the War of Jokes and Riddles established new frameworks for understanding how large-scale conflicts between criminal masterminds affected ordinary citizens, and created new forms of victimization that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The recognition that superhero conflicts inevitably involved civilian casualties added moral weight and psychological complexity that influenced how subsequent stories approached similar themes. As Batman concluded his confession to Catwoman, the full scope of how this early conflict had shaped his understanding of heroism, morality, and the prices of justice became clear. The war had taught him that good intentions were insufficient to prevent tragedy, that moral principles required practical application that sometimes conflicted with theoretical purity, and that the choice to become a hero inevitably involved accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond individual actions. But the biggest riddle may be that there isn't just one of him. The New 52 Death of the Family Endgame, the dawn of DC Comics' New 52 initiative in 2011, promised a fresh start for the entire DC universe. A complete reboot that would make decades of continuity accessible to new readers, while preserving the essential elements that had made these characters endure across generations. For most characters, this represented an opportunity to streamline complex histories and modernize outdated concepts. For the Joker, however, it became something far more significant: a chance to shed not merely his accumulated backstory but his very flesh, transforming himself from mere character into living symbol of transformation. decay, and the fluid nature of identity itself. The image that launched this new era would haunt readers' nightmares for years to come. The Joker's face, carefully removed from his skull with surgical precision and hanging like a grotesque mask from the wall of Detective Harvey Bullock's office. This wasn't mere shock value or gratuitous violence, but a profound statement about the nature of identity, performance, and the relationship between the self and its external presentation. By literally peeling away his face, the Joker had transformed himself from person into concept, from individual into archetypal force that could adopt any appearance or identity that served his purposes. The face removal, depicted in Tony S. Daniels' Detective Comics 1, represented the culmination of decades of character development that had progressively stripped away conventional human characteristics from the Joker until only his essential nature remained. Where other characters had been simplified by the New 52 reboot, the Joker had been distilled to his purest form of consciousness that existed independent of physical constraints, capable of reinventing itself moment by moment according to the demands of whatever elaborate joke or philosophical demonstration he was constructing. The psychological implications of this self-mutilation extended far beyond mere body horror to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of selfhood and performance. By removing his face, the Joker had eliminated the last barrier between his internal chaos and external presentation, becoming a figure whose appearance could change to match his mood, scheme, or philosophical point. The face wasn't merely disguise, but the final pretense of humanity that he had decided to abandon in favor of pure theatrical effectiveness. Scott Snyder's Death of the Family storyline, which emerged from this facial removal, represented perhaps the most sophisticated exploration of the Batman-Joker relationship that had ever been attempted in mainstream comics. The title itself operated on multiple levels. It referred simultaneously to the Joker's attempt to destroy Batman's surrogate family, his own symbolic death and rebirth through facial removal, and the broader theme of how families, both biological and chosen, could be sources of both strength and devastating vulnerability. The central conceit of Death of the Family, the Joker's claim that Batman's family relationships had made him weak and predictable, represented a fascinating inversion of traditional superhero logic. Where most stories treated the hero's connections to others as sources of strength and motivation, the Joker argued that these relationships had domesticated Batman, transforming him from pure force of justice into merely another member of an extended family unit, with all the compromises and limitations that such membership entailed. The Joker's wedding metaphor that ran throughout the storyline elevated their conflict from mere hero-villain opposition to something approaching theological debate about the nature of commitment, identity, and sacrifice. By framing his assault on the Bat family as preparation for a wedding between himself and Batman, the Joker was arguing that their relationship transcended normal categories of enmity and opposition to become something closer to spiritual union between complementary forces. The elaborate death traps and psychological torments that the Joker constructed for each member of the Bat family demonstrated his evolution into a criminal who operated through intimate knowledge of his victims' deepest fears and desires. Each trap was calibrated not just to cause physical harm but to reveal the psychological vulnerabilities that family membership had created. Robin's trap exploited his need to prove himself worthy of Batman's trust. Nightwing's confinement played on his fear of being replaced by newer, younger versions of himself. Batgirl's predicament forced her to confront her own mortality and the possibility that her heroic activities might be forms of elaborate self-destruction. The crown jewel of the Joker's scheme, the dinner party, where he claimed to have served the faces of the Bat family members as a grotesque feast, represented the ultimate expression of his philosophy about the cannibalistic nature of family relationships. By suggesting that Batman had been literally consuming the identities of his allies, the Joker was making a sophisticated argument about how mentorship and family formation involved the psychological consumption of individual identity in service of group cohesion. The ambiguity surrounding whether the faces were real or merely elaborate props reflected the Joker's understanding that the threat of violation was often more psychologically effective than actual violation. By leaving the question unresolved, he forced both Batman and the readers to confront their own assumptions about his limitations and moral boundaries. The possibility that he had crossed the ultimate line was sufficient to achieve his psychological objectives without requiring him to actually cross it. The resolution of Death of the Family, which saw the Bat family surviving but fundamentally changed by their experience, demonstrated the Joker's evolution into a character whose victories weren't measured in body counts but in psychological transformations. He had succeeded in creating permanent doubt about the wisdom and safety of Batman's family-building activities, introducing uncertainty into relationships that had previously been sources of unqualified strength and support. The aftermath of the storyline, which saw temporary fractures in Batman's relationships with his allies, proved that the Joker's understanding of family dynamics was more sophisticated than mere jealous outsider perspective. He had correctly identified the inherent tensions and vulnerabilities that existed within the Bat family structure and had successfully exploited them to create lasting damage that would influence their interactions for years to come. Endgame, the storyline that followed, pushed the Joker's evolution even further by introducing the possibility that he might be something more than merely human criminal who had been chemically altered by industrial accident. The Pale Man mythology suggested that the Joker might be a kind of immortal force that had existed in Gotham long before Batman's arrival, a personification of chaos that had taken different forms throughout the city's history, while maintaining essential consistency of purpose and methodology. The historical photographs showing figures resembling the Joker throughout Gotham's past, the construction of major buildings, during significant historical events, always present at moments of transition and chaos, introduced a mythological dimension to the character that transcended conventional comic book storytelling. Here was the suggestion that the Joker wasn't merely Batman's enemy, but Gotham's dark guardian angel, a force that ensured the city would never become too comfortable or complacent. The Dionysium, the chemical compound that granted regenerative properties and was linked to both the Joker's apparent immortality and Ra's al Ghul's resurrection pits, provided a scientific framework for understanding how the Joker might have survived seemingly fatal encounters throughout his long history. More significantly, it suggested that his apparent deaths and resurrections weren't mere comic book convenience, but integral aspects of his nature as a figure who existed at the boundary between life and death, order and chaos, meaning and meaninglessness. The climactic battle between Batman and the Joker in the collapsing cave system beneath Gotham represented more than mere physical confrontation. It was a symbolic return to the primordial chaos from which both characters had emerged. The possibility that both would die in the collapse, locked in eternal combat, provided a mythologically appropriate conclusion to their relationship, while leaving open the possibility of eventual return and continuation. The ambiguity of the ending, which suggested that both Batman and the Joker had died but left their ultimate fate unresolved, reflected Snyder's understanding that these characters had transcended normal narrative categories to become archetypal forces that could be destroyed but never permanently eliminated. Their conflict wasn't merely personal but cosmological, representing eternal tension between order and chaos that would persist regardless of the fate of any individual incarnation. The New 52's exploration of the Joker's relationship with his own identity through facial removal, historical mythology, and chemical transformation established new frameworks for understanding what made the character unique among comic book villains. He wasn't merely insane or evil, but existed in a state of perpetual becoming, constantly reinventing himself while maintaining essential continuity of purpose and methodology. The influence of these storylines on subsequent Batman media was enormous, establishing new templates for psychological horror and mythological storytelling that would influence everything from video games to major motion pictures. The idea that the Joker's true power lay not in his criminal activities but in his ability to force others to question their fundamental assumptions about identity, morality, and reality became a recurring theme in popular culture. The artistic achievements of Greg Capullo's visual interpretations of the faceless Joker created iconic images that would influence comic book art for years to come. The horrific beauty of the character's appearance without his face, the exposed musculature, the hollow eye sockets, the rictus grin stretched across bare bone created new visual vocabulary for depicting psychological horror in mainstream comics. The theological implications of the Pale Man mythology added layers of meaning to the character that extended beyond conventional superhero storytelling into the realm of genuine mythological narrative. The suggestion that the Joker might be an eternal force rather than merely human criminal elevated his conflict with Batman from personal vendetta to cosmic necessity, something that transcended individual choice or circumstance. The exploration of family as both strength and vulnerability provided new insights into the psychology of heroism and the prices that individuals paid for forming meaningful connections with others. The Joker's attacks on the Bat family weren't merely cruel pranks, but sophisticated analyses of how love and loyalty could be weaponized against those who experienced them. Most significantly, the New 52 era established the Joker as a character who could serve simultaneously as horror movie monster, philosophical protagonist, mythological figure, and psychological case study without losing coherence or popular appeal. His ability to function on multiple narrative levels simultaneously made him uniquely valuable as a character who could address complex themes while remaining accessible to mass audiences. As the New 52 era concluded, the Joker had been established as something far more complex and dangerous than any previous interpretation had suggested. He was no longer merely Batman's enemy but Gotham's dark conscience, a force that existed to prevent the city and its protectors from becoming too comfortable with their own righteousness and moral certainty. Even in the past, Joker is a war. The war of jokes and riddles. In the labyrinthine mythology of Batman's early career, few conflicts have proven as philosophically complex or psychologically revealing as the war of jokes and riddles, a brutal campaign that transformed Gotham City into a battlefield where two of its most intellectually sophisticated criminals waged proxy warfare through hired assassins and elaborate schemes, while Batman, still learning the rules of his own heroic identity, found himself caught between opposing forces that each represented different aspects of the chaos he had sworn to combat. Tom King's masterful exploration of this early career conflict, told through the framing device of Batman's confession to Catwoman on the night before their wedding, elevated what could have been a simple villain team-up story into something approaching tragic literature. The revelation that this war had been one of Batman's greatest failures, a conflict whose resolution had required him to compromise his moral principles in ways that would haunt him for decades, added layers of psychological complexity that transformed understanding of the Dark Knight's character development and the prices he had paid for his eventual effectiveness as Gotham's protector. The central premise that the Joker had lost his ability to find anything funny, while the Riddler had become obsessed with an unsolvable riddle, created a fascinating inversion of their traditional roles and motivations. Here was the Joker, traditionally the embodiment of chaotic humor, reduced to going through the motions of comedy without experiencing any of its psychological rewards. Meanwhile, the Riddler, usually driven by intellectual pride and the need to demonstrate superiority through puzzles, had encountered a question that defied his analytical capabilities and had become consumed by the need to solve it regardless of cost. The riddle that tormented Edward Nygma throughout the conflict, "What do you do when you're not the smartest person in the room?" operated on multiple levels of meaning and significance. On the surface, it represented his discovery that Batman's detective skills exceeded his own, a revelation that shattered his self-conception as Gotham's premier intellectual criminal. More profoundly, it reflected his recognition that intelligence alone was insufficient to impose order on a universe that seemed designed to frustrate rational understanding and logical planning. The Joker's parallel crises, inability to laugh or find humor in situations that would previously have delighted him, represented an even more fundamental disruption of identity and purpose. For a character whose entire existence was built around the philosophy that life was meaningless and the only rational response was laughter, the loss of that laughter represented something approaching spiritual death. He continued to commit crimes and construct elaborate scenarios, but they had become mechanical exercises devoid of the joy and spontaneity that had previously defined his approach to chaos. This psychological crisis transformed the Joker from agent of chaos into something more disturbing a figure, going through the motions of his established role, while feeling none of the passion that had originally motivated him. His crimes during this period possessed all the theatrical complexity of his previous work but lacked the essential element of genuine amusement that had made them effective as both criminal enterprises and philosophical statements. The war itself began over the seemingly trivial matter of which villain would be allowed to kill Batman first, but quickly escalated into a citywide conflict that divided Gotham's criminal underworld into opposing camps. The Joker's recruitment of killers like Deathstroke, Deadshot, and Victor Zsasz created an army of assassins whose methods were as varied as they were lethal. The Riddler's counter-recruitment of figures like Poison Ivy, Mr. Freeze, and the Mad Hatter created an opposing force that relied more on elaborate traps and intellectual challenges than direct violence. The genius of King's approach lay in his recognition that this conflict would inevitably draw in innocent civilians who had no stake in the philosophical differences between the two criminal masterminds, but would suffer the consequences of their proxy war nonetheless. The story of Kite Man Charles Brown, whose son died as collateral damage in one of the Riddler's schemes, provided human scale and emotional weight to what could have been merely an intellectual exercise in criminal psychology. The transformation of Charles Brown from ordinary citizen to costumed criminal represented one of the war's most tragic casualties and most profound statements about the nature of victimization and response to trauma. His adoption of the Kite Man persona wasn't driven by the same philosophical concerns that motivated the Joker and Riddler, nor by the moral mission that defined Batman, but by simple need to find meaning and agency in a world that had demonstrated its complete indifference to his family's welfare. Batman's position throughout the conflict revealed the extent to which his early career limitations made him inadequate to address the kind of systemic chaos that the war represented. His usual methods, detective work, individual confrontation, moral example, were insufficient to stop a conflict that had transformed the entire city into a battleground where every citizen was a potential casualty and every location was a potential target. The psychological portrait of the young Batman that emerged from this storyline showed a hero still learning the practical applications of his moral principles and discovering that good intentions were insufficient to prevent tragedy when faced with enemies who operated according to completely different logical frameworks. His growing frustration and desperation as the war escalated beyond his ability to control represented crucial character development that explained elements of his later methodology and psychological makeup. The revelation that Batman had ultimately ended the war by threatening to kill the Riddler, a violation of his no-kill rule that remained theoretical rather than actual, but nonetheless represented a fundamental compromise of his moral principles, provided new understanding of how his absolute moral code had been tested and refined through practical experience. The fact that this threat had been effective demonstrated both the power of his moral reputation and the psychological costs of maintaining it under extreme circumstances. The Joker's reaction to witnessing Batman's moral compromise, his sudden return to laughter and apparent joy at seeing the Dark Knight forced to consider murder, revealed the extent to which his psychological crisis had been connected to his relationship with Batman specifically. The loss of his ability to laugh hadn't been random psychological breakdown but response to Batman's moral certainty, which had made his own philosophy of meaninglessness seem less compelling and entertaining. The restoration of the Joker's laughter through Batman's moral crisis created a disturbing symbiosis that explained elements of their future relationship and the Joker's continued obsession with testing Batman's moral boundaries. He had learned that Batman's righteousness wasn't invulnerable to pressure and that sufficient escalation could force even the most morally certain individuals to compromise their principles. The Riddler's fate, defeated not through superior intellect, but through Batman's willingness to abandon intellectual competition in favor of direct threat, represented a different kind of philosophical resolution. His riddle had been answered not through logical analysis, but through demonstration that some problems required action rather than understanding, that intelligence without moral framework was insufficient to impose order on chaotic situations. The broader implications of the war extended beyond its immediate participants to encompass questions about the nature of heroism, the responsibilities of power, and the prices that individuals paid for maintaining moral principles in immoral environments. Batman's confession to Selina revealed the extent to which his early experiences had shaped his understanding of what heroism required and what costs it imposed on those who chose to pursue it. The framing device of Batman's pre-wedding confession added layers of meaning about truth, intimacy, and the ways that past traumas influenced present relationships. His decision to reveal this failure to Catwoman represented recognition that genuine intimacy required acknowledgement of moral complexity and psychological vulnerability. That love meant accepting the full truth of another person's character, rather than idealized versions of who they might be. The artistic achievement of Mikel Janin's visual storytelling, particularly in depicting the escalating violence and psychological strain of the extended conflict, created new visual vocabulary for representing the kind of large-scale urban warfare that the storyline described. The images of Gotham transformed into battleground, of ordinary citizens caught between opposing criminal forces, of Batman struggling to maintain moral clarity while surrounded by systemic chaos, provided powerful commentary on the realities of vigilante justice and its limitations. The influence of this storyline on subsequent Batman stories was significant, establishing new understanding of how the character's moral code had been developed and tested through practical experience rather than abstract philosophical consideration. The revelation that even Batman had been forced to consider compromise added psychological complexity that made his later moral certainty more meaningful and hard-won. The exploration of how trauma could create both heroes and villains, often from the same circumstances, provided sophisticated analysis of the factors that determined individual responses to suffering and injustice. The contrast between Batman's transformation of trauma into mission, the Joker's transformation of trauma into philosophy, and Kite Man's transformation of trauma into identity revealed the arbitrary nature of how individuals processed and responded to life-changing events. Most significantly, the War of Jokes and Riddles established new frameworks for understanding how large-scale conflicts between criminal masterminds affected ordinary citizens, and created new forms of victimization that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The recognition that superhero conflicts inevitably involved civilian casualties added moral weight and psychological complexity that influenced how subsequent stories approached similar themes. As Batman concluded his confession to Catwoman, the full scope of how this early conflict had shaped his understanding of heroism, morality, and the prices of justice became clear. The war had taught him that good intentions were insufficient to prevent tragedy, that moral principles required practical application that sometimes conflicted with theoretical purity, and that the choice to become a hero inevitably involved accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond individual actions. But the biggest riddle may be that there isn't just one of him. 3 Jokers. The name question. In the deepest recesses of the Batcave, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of decades spent combating Gotham's criminal element, sits the Mobius Chira cosmic artifact that grants its occupant access to all knowledge in the universe. When Batman briefly claimed this throne of omniscience during the Darkseid War, he could have asked any question about any mystery that had ever plagued him. He could have learned the location of every missing person, the solution to every unsolved case, the true identity of every masked criminal who had ever escaped his detective work. Instead, he asked 3 questions that would fundamentally alter his understanding of his greatest enemy and, perhaps more disturbing, reveal the inadequacy of his own assumptions about the nature of identity, madness, and evil itself. The first question concerned the Joker's true identity. The second asked about his father's killer, but it was the answer to his third question. Is there more than one Joker? That would prove most unsettling. The chair's response was as simple as it was paradigm-shattering. There are 3. This revelation didn't merely complicate the Joker's mythology. It fundamentally deconstructed everything that readers and characters had assumed about the nature of individual identity and the possibility of singular evil in a universe that seemed increasingly committed to demonstrating that nothing was as simple as it appeared. Jeff Johns' 3 Jokers storyline, developed from this cosmic revelation, represented more than mere continuity management or attempt to reconcile contradictory interpretations of the character across different eras and creative teams. It was a sophisticated exploration of how mythological figures evolved through cultural interpretation, how different aspects of complex personalities could manifest as seemingly separate individuals, and how the search for definitive truth about iconic characters might be less important than understanding what those characters represented in the collective imagination. The 3 Jokers designated as the criminal, the clown, and the comedian each embodied different aspects of the character's evolution and different responses to the fundamental questions that had driven his development across 8 decades of storytelling. The criminal represented the Golden Age incarnation, the cold-blooded killer whose crimes were motivated by practical objectives and whose theatricality served primarily to enhance his effectiveness as a murderer. The clown embodied the Silver Age transformation, the whimsical prankster whose schemes prioritized entertainment value over body count, but who retained the essential amorality that made him dangerous despite his apparent harmlessness. The comedian synthesized these earlier incarnations with the psychological complexity of modern interpretations, representing the philosophical terrorist whose crimes served as elaborate demonstrations of his nihilistic worldview. This tripartite division provided a framework for understanding how a single character could simultaneously embody contradictory characteristics without losing coherence or consistency. The Joker could be both ruthless killer and harmless prankster, both philosophical, sophisticate, and simple madman, both random agent of chaos and calculating mastermind, because these aspects had been distributed across three distinct individuals who shared common origins and essential philosophy, while expressing them through different methodologies and priorities. The revelation that these three figures had been coordinating their activities across decades, taking turns appearing as the Joker, while the others remained hidden, explained how the character had been able to survive seemingly fatal encounters, escape from maximum security facilities with suspicious regularity, and demonstrate knowledge and capabilities that seemed to exceed what any single individual could reasonably possess. The apparent resurrections weren't miraculous recoveries, but carefully orchestrated substitutions, each Joker stepping forward to continue the performance when one of the others had been captured or temporarily incapacitated. The psychological implications of this arrangement were profound. Here were three individuals who had abandoned their separate identities so completely that they existed primarily as facets of a shared persona, a collective consciousness that transcended individual selfhood to become something approaching mythological archetype. They had achieved a form of immortality not through supernatural means, but through the deliberate fragmentation and multiplication of their essential identity across multiple bodies and minds. The criminal's role as the apparent leader of this trinity reflected his status as the original incarnation and his commitment to the practical applications of chaos. His schemes throughout Three Jokers demonstrated the cold calculation that had made the Golden Age Joker so effective, the ability to plan elaborate crimes with military precision while maintaining the theatrical flair that distinguished him from conventional criminals. His interactions with the other two Jokers revealed a hierarchical relationship based on seniority and strategic sophistication rather than simple dominance. The clown's position as the group's primary public face made sense given his development during the era when the character had been required to operate within the constraints of the Comics Code Authority. His ability to appear harmless while remaining fundamentally dangerous made him ideal for situations that required public interaction or media manipulation. His crimes during the storyline retained the whimsical quality of his Silver Age appearances while serving the darker objectives that the criminal had established. The comedian's role as the group's philosopher and psychological warfare specialist reflected his emergence during the Bronze Age and his refinement through stories like The Killing Joke and Death in Family. His understanding of human psychology and his ability to craft scenarios that forced his victims to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their world made him the most dangerous of the three despite his often non-lethal methods. His crimes were designed not just to cause immediate harm, but to create lasting psychological damage that would continue affecting victims long after the initial encounter had ended. The central plot of Three Jokers, the attempt to create a perfect Joker, through the systematic corruption of individuals who resembled Batman in their response to trauma, revealed the extent to which all three versions of the character remained obsessed with their relationship to the Dark Knight. The abduction and torture of Joe Chill, the man who had killed Bruce Wayne's parents, represented their recognition that Batman's origin story was the key to understanding what made him unique among those who had experienced similar tragedies. The attempted transformation of Joe Chill into a fourth Joker through chemical alteration and psychological manipulation demonstrated the Three Jokers' belief that anyone could be converted to their philosophy given sufficient trauma and the right kind of chemical catalyst. Their failure to achieve this transformation, Chill's suicide rather than acceptance of their worldview, suggested that there were aspects of individual psychology and moral character that transcended circumstance and chemical alteration. Batman's investigation of the Three Jokers forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own methods and motivations. The revelation that he had known the Joker's original identity for years but had chosen not to pursue or reveal it suggested that his relationship with his greatest enemy was more complex than simple law enforcement. His protection of the Joker's family, wife, and children who had been relocated and given new identities revealed his recognition that some forms of justice transcended legal categories and required more sophisticated moral calculations. The identity question that had driven much of the storyline, the suggestion that the original Joker might have been Jack Oswald White, a name that appeared in certain continuities but remained contested and uncertain, deliberately avoided, providing definitive answers in favor of exploring what those answers might mean. The Joker's insistence that his identity was irrelevant because he had transcended individual selfhood to become pure concept reflected his understanding that mythological figures derived their power from their archetypal significance rather than their biographical details. The relationship between the three Jokers and Harley Quinn added another layer of complexity to the character dynamics. Her romantic involvement with the comedian, her professional relationship with the criminal, and her ambivalent feelings toward the clown revealed how different aspects of the same essential personality could evoke different emotional responses from the same individual. Her eventual rejection of all three versions in favor of independent identity represented a form of psychological liberation that paralleled her broader character development across recent storylines. The resolution of three Jokers, which saw the criminal apparently killed by Joe Chill and the comedian murdered by the clown in a dispute over methodology and philosophy, reduced the Trinity back to a single active Joker, while preserving the possibility that other versions might emerge in the future. This resolution satisfied the dramatic requirements of the storyline, while maintaining the essential mystery and ambiguity that had always defined the character. The broader implications of the three Jokers concept extended beyond comic book storytelling to encompass questions about the nature of identity, consciousness, and evil in the modern world. The idea that a single mythological figure could manifest as multiple individuals reflected contemporary anxieties about the fragmentation of identity in digital age and the ways that personas could be distributed across multiple platforms and presentations. The theological dimensions of the storyline also deserved consideration. The Trinity of Jokers echoed religious concepts of multiple aspects within unified divinity, suggesting that the character had achieved a form of dark apotheosis that transcended normal categories of individual identity. Their ability to coordinate activities across decades while maintaining separate existences suggested a form of communion that paralleled mystical traditions while serving entirely malevolent purposes. The influence of three Jokers on subsequent Batman media was significant, providing new frameworks for understanding how the character's contradictory aspects could coexist within a coherent mythology. The idea that apparent inconsistencies in characterization might reflect genuine multiplicity rather than creative confusion offered new possibilities for exploring the Joker's evolution and development across different interpretations. The artistic achievement of Jason Fabok's visual storytelling, particularly in distinguishing between the three versions while maintaining their essential similarity, created new visual vocabulary for depicting character variation within archetypal consistency. The careful attention to costume details, facial expressions, and body language that differentiated the criminal, clown, and comedian demonstrated how subtle variations could convey significant differences in personality and methodology. The exploration of Batman's knowledge of the Joker's identity and his decision to protect the man's family added moral complexity that elevated the storyline beyond simple superhero adventure into more sophisticated ethical territory. The recognition that justice sometimes required protecting criminals' loved ones from the consequences of their actions reflected mature understanding of how moral principles operated in complex real-world situations. Most significantly, Three Jokers established the principle that some characters had transcended individual identity to become collective concepts that could manifest in multiple forms while maintaining essential consistency. This framework provided new tools for understanding how mythological figures evolved through cultural interpretation and how different aspects of complex personalities could be explored through apparently separate narratives. As the storyline concluded with the surviving Joker's assertion that he didn't need a name because he had become something beyond individual identity, the stage was set for exploring what this evolution meant for his future development and his continued relationship with Batman. The mystery of his identity had been resolved not through revelation but through transcendence, demonstrating that some questions became irrelevant when the figures they concerned had evolved beyond the categories that made those questions meaningful. He doesn't need a name, only a stage. And in 2020, he steals the whole city. Joker War, Punchline, and the New Blood. The year 2020 brought with it a global pandemic that transformed cities into battlegrounds between order and chaos, where established institutions struggled to maintain authority, while new forms of social organization emerged from the resulting confusion and fear. Into this changed world stepped a version of the Joker who had learned from decades of theoretical exploration and was finally ready to test his philosophy on a scale that would encompass not merely individual victims or small groups but an entire metropolitan population of millions. The Joker War represented the culmination of everything the character had learned about media manipulation, psychological warfare, economic terrorism, and mass psychology, distilled into a campaign that would transform Gotham City from merely another urban center into a laboratory for testing what happened when chaos was given institutional authority. James Tynion IV's orchestration of this citywide conflict demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how modern terrorism operated through information networks, economic systems, and social media platforms rather than merely physical violence. The Joker's assault on Gotham wasn't simply another elaborate criminal scheme, but a systematic deconstruction of everything that made civilized society function, from financial infrastructure to emergency services to the basic trust relationships that allowed large populations to coexist peacefully. The genius of the Joker's strategy lay in his recognition that Wayne Enterprises' integration into Gotham's essential services had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone who gained control of the company's resources and technological capabilities. By targeting the Wayne fortune and the extensive network of businesses, charities, and municipal services that depended on it, the Joker had found a way to attack Batman's effectiveness as a hero, while simultaneously demonstrating his own philosophy about the arbitrary nature of the institutions that people relied upon for security and stability. The introduction of Punchline as the Joker's new partner and potential successor represented more than mere replacement for Harley Quinn, but reflected the character's evolution to address contemporary anxieties about radicalization, social media manipulation, and the ways that charismatic figures could recruit followers through carefully crafted online personas. Where Harley Quinn had been seduced through personal interaction and psychological manipulation, Punchline had been recruited through digital platforms and had arrived at her devotion to the Joker's cause through intellectual rather than emotional channels. Alexis Kay's transformation into Punchline provided fascinating contrast to Dr. Harleen Quinzel's earlier corruption by the same figure. Where Harley had been a mental health professional whose empathy and desire to help had been weaponized against her, Punchline was a student whose academic study of the Joker's methodology had led her to embrace his philosophy as intellectually superior to conventional moral frameworks. Her recruitment represented the Joker's evolution from simple corrupter of individuals to sophisticated ideological leader capable of inspiring genuine philosophical conversion. The cold, calculating nature of Punchline's dedication to chaos reflected changes in how radicalization operated in the digital age. Her crimes weren't motivated by romantic attachment or psychological dependence, but by genuine belief that the Joker's worldview represented superior understanding of reality and more honest response to existence than conventional social values. This intellectual foundation made her potentially more dangerous than Harley because it was based on reasoned analysis rather than emotional manipulation, and was therefore less susceptible to counter-arguments based on personal relationships or psychological therapy. The branding aspects of Punchline's persona, her carefully crafted social media presence, her merchandising strategy, her appeal to young audiences who saw her as representation of authentic rebellion against hypocritical adult authority demonstrated the Joker's mastery of contemporary marketing techniques and his understanding of how ideological movements could be packaged as lifestyle choices for mass consumption. She wasn't merely his partner in crime, but his brand ambassador, responsible for expanding his philosophical influence beyond criminal activity into broader cultural territory. The emergence of Clown Hunter as Gotham's vigilante response to the Joker War added another layer of complexity to the moral equations that the conflict had created. Bapham's transformation from traumatized teenager into masked killer represented the logical endpoint of exposure to the kind of systematic chaos that the Joker had unleashed. His willingness to kill Joker-affiliated criminals that Batman and the police couldn't permanently contain reflected the failure of established institutions to address the scale of the threat that the Joker War had created. Clown Hunter's methodology, the systematic execution of anyone who had participated in Joker-related crimes, represented a form of rough justice that appealed to citizens who had lost faith in official law enforcement's ability to protect them from the kind of large-scale terrorism that the Joker had demonstrated. His popularity among certain segments of Gotham's population revealed the extent to which the Joker War had damaged public confidence in Batman's non-lethal approach to crime fighting. The psychological profile that emerged from Clown Hunter's activities showed how the Joker's influence could create new forms of heroism that were fundamentally opposed to Batman's moral framework while serving similar protective functions. Here was a figure who had been created by the Joker's actions, but who rejected the Joker's philosophy in favor of a more primitive form of justice based on elimination rather than rehabilitation. His existence proved that the Joker's crimes could generate responses that transcended the simple hero-villain dynamic to create entirely new categories of moral actor. The media manipulation aspects of the Joker War demonstrated the character's evolution into something approaching a multimedia conglomerate with the resources and sophistication to conduct psychological warfare on a scale that encompassed traditional news outlets, social media platforms, and entertainment properties. His ability to control narrative flow, manufacture controversies, and manipulate public opinion reflected decades of study of how modern information systems operated and could be exploited for ideological purposes. The economic terrorism component of the Joker's strategies, systematic destruction of Gotham's financial infrastructure, and his redistribution of the Wayne fortune to fund his operations represented sophisticated understanding of how wealth functioned as a form of power in contemporary society. By attacking Batman's economic resources, he was simultaneously weakening his operational capabilities and demonstrating his philosophical point about the arbitrary nature of wealth distribution and institutional authority. The recruitment of criminal followers through economic incentives rather than ideological conversion revealed the Joker's pragmatic understanding that most people's commitment to chaos was conditional and required ongoing financial motivation. His willingness to pay competitive wages for criminal activity and to provide comprehensive benefits packages for his employees demonstrated that even agents of chaos needed to operate according to certain economic principles if they wanted to maintain large-scale organizations. The transformation of Gotham's social fabric during the war showed how quickly established institutions could collapse when subjected to systematic attack by forces that understood their vulnerabilities and dependencies. The breakdown of emergency services, the failure of municipal government, the retreat of federal authority all demonstrated the fragility of the systems that people relied upon for basic security and the speed with which civilization could dissolve under sufficient pressure. Batman's response to the Joker War revealed the limitations of individual heroism when confronted with institutional-scale chaos. His usual methods, detective work, direct confrontation, moral example, proved inadequate to address a conflict that had transformed the entire city into a battlefield where every citizen was either victim, perpetrator, or potential recruit for opposing sides. The war forced him to operate more as military commander than individual crime fighter, coordinating resources and managing allies in ways that his traditional lone wolf approach hadn't prepared him for. The resolution of the conflict through combination of Batman's tactical planning, the Bat family's coordinated response, and eventual intervention by federal authorities demonstrated that some forms of chaos could only be addressed through institutional rather than individual action. The Joker's defeat came not through superior heroism but through superior organization and resource management, proving that even the most sophisticated chaos agents were vulnerable to coordinated opposition with adequate resources. The aftermath of the Joker War left Gotham fundamentally changed in ways that would influence its development for years to come. The damage to public confidence in established authority, the emergence of new forms of vigilante activity, the recognition that the city's essential services were vulnerable to systematic attack created new realities that Batman and other protectors would need to address through evolved methodologies and expanded understanding of their responsibilities. The psychological impact on Batman himself was equally significant. The war had forced him to confront the limitations of his individual approach to crime fighting and the need for more systematic solutions to institutional-scale problems. His willingness to work more closely with federal authorities, and his recognition that some threats required governmental response rather than vigilante action, represented important character development that would influence his future. Methodology. The influence of the Joker War on subsequent Batman media was substantial, establishing new templates for large-scale conflict and institutional terrorism that reflected contemporary anxieties about the fragility of social systems and the speed with which established order could collapse under coordinated attack. The storyline's exploration of economic warfare, media manipulation, and ideological recruitment provided new frameworks for understanding how modern terrorism operated and how traditional heroic responses might prove inadequate to address its challenges. Most significantly, the Joker War established the character as a figure capable of operating simultaneously as individual criminal, ideological leader, media phenomenon, and institutional threat without losing coherence or consistency. His evolution from simple villain to complex social force represented the culmination of decades of character development and provided new possibilities for exploring his future impact on Batman's world and methodology. The laughter scatters worldwide, and the hunter becomes the hunted. Infinite Frontier Era. The Joker. Ongoing, global fallout. The conclusion of the Joker War marked not the end of the Clown Prince of Crime's evolution, but rather the beginning of his most ambitious transformation yet. The leap from Gotham-based terrorist to international fugitive, from local menace to global phenomenon, from Batman's primary antagonist to the world's problem. The establishment of an ongoing Joker series in 2021, written by James Tynion IV and later Matthew Rosenberg, represented an unprecedented experiment in comic book publishing, the sustained exploration of one of fiction's most dangerous villains as protagonist rather than antagonist, operating outside the moral and geographical constraints that had previously defined his activities. The series opened with a premise that inverted traditional superhero storytelling. Here was the villain fleeing from the consequences of his actions, pursued not by heroes seeking justice but by enemies seeking revenge, operating in unfamiliar territory without the institutional knowledge and geographical advantages that had made him so effective in Gotham. The Joker found himself in the unprecedented position of being the hunted rather than the hunter, forced to adapt his methodology to environments and cultures that didn't share Gotham's particular brand of Gothic dysfunction. The catalyst for this global odyssey was the 8th anniversary of the Arkham Asylum breakout that had initiated the Joker Warrant, the systematic campaign of violence that the Joker orchestrated to commemorate this milestone. The international scope of these attacks, coordinated across multiple time zones and targeting individuals who had no apparent connection to Batman or Gotham, demonstrated the extent to which the Joker's influence had metastasized beyond its original boundaries to become a form of ideological contagion, capable of inspiring copycat attacks and franchise operations across the globe. Jim Gordon's assignment to lead the international manhunt for the Joker represented more than mere police procedural, but rather the exploration of how traditional law enforcement methods proved inadequate when dealing with criminals who operated according to fundamentally different logical frameworks. Gordon's expertise in conventional detective work and his decades of experience with the Joker's methodology provided him with certain advantages, but his moral certainty and faith in institutional justice made him vulnerable to the kind of psychological warfare that the Joker had perfected through years of studying heroic psychology. The international chase that followed revealed the extent to which the Joker's philosophy and methodology had evolved to encompass not merely individual corruption but systematic analysis of different cultural approaches to justice, authority, and social organization. Each country that Gordon pursued him through became a laboratory for testing how different societies responded to the introduction of pure chaos, with the Joker serving simultaneously as criminal fugitive and anthropological researcher, studying the fault lines and vulnerabilities that existed within various forms of civilization. The Sampson family storyline, which wove throughout the series, provided emotional and moral weight to what could have been merely an intellectual exercise in criminal psychology. The systematic targeting of this ordinary family by the Joker not because of any connection to Batman or participation in heroic activities, but simply because their normal happiness represented everything that his philosophy opposed, demonstrated the evolution of his methodology from reactive terrorism to proactive assault on the very concept of human contentment, meaning the psychological profile of the Joker that emerged from his interactions with the Sampson family revealed the extent to which his worldview had crystallized into something approaching systematic theology. His inability to tolerate the existence of genuine happiness, his compulsion to prove that all human attachments were ultimately meaningless, his need to demonstrate that suffering was the only honest response to existence all, reflected the evolution of his character from simple criminal to something approaching the physical manifestation of nihilistic philosophy. The introduction of Vengeance Bane's daughter, whose quest for revenge against the Joker for her father's death during the Joker warranted generational complexity to the character's mythology and demonstrated how his actions created enemies who operated according to different moral frameworks than the traditional heroes who had previously opposed him. Where Batman sought justice and Gordon pursued legal resolution, Vengeance sought simple retribution, representing a form of opposition that was more compatible with the Joker's own amoral approach to conflict resolution. The relationship between Vengeance and the Joker explored how different forms of extremism could interact and evolve through mutual opposition. Her willingness to kill and her rejection of conventional moral constraints made her a more dangerous opponent than traditional heroes, because she was willing to engage with the Joker on his own terms, without the self-imposed limitations that had allowed him to manipulate previous adversaries. Their conflict represented the collision between two different forms of Kayoshi's, philosophical, and hers, emotional, with unpredictable results for both participants. The shadow cabals and international conspiracies that emerged throughout Gordon's investigation revealed the extent to which the Joker's activities had created secondary markets in chaos, violence, and ideological extremism. Various organizations had recognized the commercial and political potential of the chaos that the Joker generated and had begun developing their own methods for profiting from and directing the social disruption that followed in wake. These revelations transformed the series from simple chase narrative into exploration of how modern terrorism operated through networks of affiliated organizations, franchise operations, and ideological recruitment that transcended national boundaries and traditional law enforcement capabilities. The Joker hadn't merely escaped from Gotham, had become the center of an international ecosystem of violence and extremism that existed independently of his direct control while drawing inspiration and methodology from his example. The concept of the Joker as contagion became increasingly central to understanding his role in the broader DC universe. His philosophy and methodology had achieved a form of viral distribution that allowed them to reproduce and evolve through contact with new hosts, creating versions of his chaos that were adapted to local conditions while maintaining essential consistency with his original vision. This ideological reproduction made him far more dangerous than any individual criminal could be, because it meant that eliminating him personally would not eliminate the movement he had created. The exploration of different cultural responses to the Joker's chaos provided fascinating insights into how various societies understood concepts like justice, authority, and individual responsibility. His ability to find and exploit weaknesses in different forms of social organization demonstrated the universality of certain human vulnerabilities, while revealing how different cultures had developed different methods for managing and containing antisocial behavior. The series' examination of Gordon's psychological deterioration throughout the extended chase showed how prolonged exposure to the Joker's methodology could corrupt even the most morally stable individuals. Gordon's growing willingness to compromise legal procedures, his increasing violence toward suspects, his gradual adoption of methods that resembled the Joker's own approach to problem-solving all demonstrated that the character's true power lay not in his criminal activities, but in his ability to transform others into versions of himself through sustained psychological pressure. The recurring theme of the Sampson family's systematic destruction, Gordon's relationship with his daughter Barbara, Vengeance's quest to avenge her father revealed how the Joker's understanding of human psychology had evolved to focus on the relationships that gave people meaning and motivation. His attacks weren't random but carefully calibrated to demonstrate that love, loyalty, and hope were vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone sufficiently committed to proving their meaninglessness. The international scope of the series also allowed for exploration of how the Joker's American origins and cultural references translated to different contexts, and how his philosophy adapted to address local concerns and anxieties. His ability to find universal themes within culturally specific expressions of chaos demonstrated the sophistication of his psychological insights and his evolution from mere criminal to something approaching anthropological researcher with homicidal applications. The resolution of Gordon's manhunt, which ultimately required international cooperation and resources that exceeded what any individual law enforcement agency could provide, demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional approaches to criminal justice when dealing with threats that operated on global scales and drew power from ideological rather than merely practical motivations. The Joker's capture wasn't the result of superior detective work, but of coordinated institutional response that treated him as military rather than criminal threat. The broader implications of the Infinite Frontier era extended beyond comic book storytelling to encompass contemporary anxieties about terrorism, social media radicalization, and the ways that extremist ideologies could spread across cultural and national boundaries through digital platforms and international travel. The Joker's evolution from local villain to global phenomenon reflected real-world concerns about how individual actors could leverage modern communication and transportation systems to create disproportionate impacts on international security and social stability. Most significantly, the ongoing series established the Joker as a character who could sustain narrative interest as protagonist rather than merely antagonist, whose psychology and methodology were sufficiently complex to support extended exploration without losing mystery or menace. His evolution from Batman's enemy to the world's problem represented the culmination of decades of character development and provided new frameworks for understanding how comic book villains could address serious themes while maintaining their entertainment value. As the series continued to explore the global ramifications of the Joker's philosophy and the international efforts required to contain them, the character had achieved a form of cultural significance that transcended his origins in superhero fiction to become a symbol of how individual extremism could challenge institutional authority and social stability in the interconnected modern world. But some of his deadliest echoes come from other worlds and darker multiverses. Beyond Gotham, Elseworlds, multiverses, and major non-canon turns, in the infinite expanse of the multiverse, where every possibility spawns its own reality and every choice creates new worlds of consequence, the Joker's laugh echoes across dimensions with a resonance that transcends the boundaries of any single continuity. These alternate realities serve not merely as creative exercises or commercial exploitations of a popular character, but as laboratories for exploring the fundamental questions that the Joker represents. What happens when chaos triumphs absolutely? What becomes of a world where the joke is not merely told but lived? How does the absence of moral constraint reshape the very foundations of existence itself? The most terrifying answer to these questions emerged from the dark multiverse in the form of the Batman who laughs, a figure whose very existence represented the ultimate corruption of everything that Batman had ever stood for. Bruce Wayne of Earth, 22, had been exposed to a concentrated form of Joker toxin during what should have been his final confrontation with his greatest enemy, a chemical baptism that had stripped away his moral certainty and replaced it with the Joker's nihilistic clarity, while leaving intact all of Batman's tactical brilliance, strategic thinking, and comprehensive knowledge of heroic psychology. The horror of the Batman who laughs lay not in his descent into madness, but in his ascension to a form of terrible sanity that combined Batman's methodical approach to problem-solving with the Joker's absolute freedom from moral constraint. Here was a figure who possessed all of Batman's skills and resources, but who had been liberated from the ethical framework that had previously limited their application. His crimes weren't random acts of violence or theatrical demonstrations, but systematic campaigns designed to corrupt and destroy entire realities with the same efficiency that Batman had once brought to protecting them. The visual iconography of the Batman who laughs, the familiar cowl twisted into a rictus grin, the metal blindfold that covered eyes that had seen too much truth about the nature of existence, the chains that held rabid robins as attack, dog-screeded new vocabulary for depicting the complete inversion of heroic symbols. Every element of Batman's traditional appearance had been transformed into its opposite while maintaining recognizable similarity, creating uncanny valley effect that made the character simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The philosophical implications of this character extended far beyond simple what-if scenarios to encompass genuine questions about the relationship between morality and effectiveness in heroic action. The Batman Who Laughs represented proof that Batman's moral code wasn't merely personal preference but an essential component of his identity as hero, that removing that moral framework didn't create a more effective Batman but something that was no longer Batman at all. Despite maintaining all of his surface characteristics and capabilities, the dark multiverse invasions orchestrated by the Batman Who Laughs demonstrated how the Joker's philosophy could be weaponized through Batman's strategic capabilities. His recruitment of other corrupted versions of familiar heroes, the Red Death, the Merciless, the Devastator, created an army of figures who had each fallen to different aspects of the chaos that the original Joker represented, proving that corruption could take multiple forms while serving the same ultimate purpose of destroying meaning and hope. The events of Dark Knight's Metal and its sequels established the Batman Who Laughs as a threat that transcended individual realities to encompass the entire structure of the multiverse itself. His understanding of how different realities connected and influenced each other, combined with his complete lack of moral restraint in exploiting those connections, made him capable of destroying not just individual worlds but the very concept of heroism across all possible realities. At the opposite end of the moral spectrum, Sean Murphy's Batman White Knight presented an entirely different exploration of what the Joker could become when freed from the constraints of traditional continuity. The transformation of Jack Napier from homicidal maniac into rational social reformer represented a fascinating inversion that explored whether the Joker's criticism of Gotham's institutional failures might have validity independent of his violent methodology. The White Knight universe's exploration of the Joker's potential for redemption raised disturbing questions about the nature of his relationship with Batman and the possibility that their eternal conflict served to maintain a status quo that benefited neither character nor the city they claimed to protect. Napier's systematic exposure of corruption within the GCPD, his revelation of the financial costs of Batman's vigilante activities, his documentation of the collateral damage caused by their conflicts all served to recontextualize their relationship as potentially codependent rather than genuinely heroic. The psychological complexity of the reformed Joker's relationship with Harley Quinn in this continuity provided insights into how his capacity for genuine human connection had been suppressed rather than eliminated by madness. His ability to form meaningful romantic partnership when freed from his obsession with Batman suggested that his isolation and nihilism might have been symptoms of his fixation on their conflict rather than fundamental aspects of his character. The Injustice universe presented perhaps the most successful example of the Joker, achieving his ultimate philosophical objective through a single, perfectly calculated action. His murder of Lois Lane and destruction of Metropolis succeeded not merely in killing Superman's wife and destroying his adopted city, but in transforming the Man of Steel into the kind of authoritarian ruler that the Joker had always insisted lurked beneath the surface of every hero's righteous facade. The genius of the Injustice Joker's final scheme lay in its recognition that heroes' greatest vulnerability wasn't their moral code, but their faith in that code's universal applicability. By creating a scenario where Superman's adherence to his traditional principles resulted in catastrophic loss, the Joker had proved that moral certainty was a luxury that could be stripped away by sufficient trauma, leaving even the most principled individuals vulnerable to the kind of extremism that he had always represented. The Joker's death at Superman's hands in the Injustice timeline represented both his ultimate victory and his final joke. He had succeeded in proving his point about the arbitrary nature of heroic morality so completely that his continued existence became unnecessary. His philosophy lived on through Superman's increasingly authoritarian methods and the civil war that divided the superhero community, demonstrating that ideas could be more dangerous than their originators and more difficult to destroy. The Flashpoint universe's revelation that Martha Wayne had become the Joker in the timeline where Bruce had died instead of his parents provided profound insights into how grief and trauma could manifest in different individuals exposed to identical circumstances. This version of the character possessed all of the traditional Joker's nihilistic philosophy and theatrical methodology, while being motivated by maternal loss rather than abstract philosophical conviction. The confrontation between Martha Wayne's Joker and her son Bruce in the Flashpoint timeline created one of the most emotionally devastating scenes in comic book history, as she was forced to confront the reality that her grief had transformed her into the kind of monster that her son had dedicated his life to fighting. Her suicide upon learning about Batman's existence in other timelines represented the ultimate expression of despair and the recognition that some forms of damage were too fundamental to repair. The Arkham video game universe, beginning with Arkham Asylum and culminating in Arkham Knight, provided an interactive exploration of the Joker's philosophy that allowed players to experience directly the psychological warfare and institutional corruption that defined his methodology. The game's progression from simple containment scenario to citywide chaos to posthumous psychological domination demonstrated how the character's influence could extend beyond death through carefully planted seeds of doubt, corruption. The Arkham Joker's final victory, his ability to corrupt Batman from beyond the grave through a combination of chemical alteration and psychological manipulation, represented the ultimate expression of his belief that anyone could be transformed into a version of himself given sufficient pressure and the right catalysts. The fear toxin-induced hallucinations that allowed the dead Joker to continue tormenting Batman proved that his true power had never been physical but psychological, existing in the realm of ideas and anxieties rather than mere criminal activity. The voice work of Mark Hamill throughout the Arkham series established new standards for how the character's vocal presentation could convey both manic humor and genuine menace simultaneously. His ability to shift instantaneously between childlike glee and cold calculation created audio portrait of a consciousness that existed outside normal emotional categories while remaining recognizably human in its fundamental loneliness and need for attention. The Batman Damned storyline by Brian Azzarello and Lee Bermejo pushed the character into genuinely supernatural territory, exploring what might happen if the Joker's apparent resurrections and seeming immortality were literal rather than merely dramatic convenience. The suggestion that he might be a demon or spiritual entity rather than merely human criminal provided new framework for understanding his relationship with Batman as potentially cosmic rather than merely personal conflict. The artistic achievement of these various interpretations demonstrated the character's remarkable flexibility as a creative vehicle. Whether portrayed as cosmic threat, political reformer, grieving mother, video game antagonist, or supernatural entity, the essential elements of his character, the laugh, the chaos, the philosophical nihilism, the obsession with proving that meaning was arbitrary remained consistent, while allowing for radical reinterpretation of his origins, methods, and ultimate objectives. The influence of these alternate versions on mainstream continuity was significant, with successful elements being incorporated into regular Batman comics, while unsuccessful experiments provided valuable lessons about which aspects of the character were essential and which were merely cosmetic. The multiverse approach allowed creators to test extreme interpretations without permanently damaging the character's core mythology, while providing fresh perspectives on familiar themes and relationships. The theological implications of these various interpretations also deserved consideration. The recurring theme of the Joker as tempter figure, the character who offered others the freedom of embracing chaos and meaninglessness, echoed religious traditions about the nature of evil and its relationship to free will and moral choice. His consistent role as the figure who forced heroes to confront the limitations and potential arbitrariness of their moral codes suggested archetypal significance that transcended comic book storytelling. Most significantly, these alternate interpretations established the Joker as a character whose essential nature was so fundamental to human psychology and social organization that he could manifest across any conceivable reality or circumstances. Whether as corrupted hero, reformed villain, grieving mother, or supernatural entity, he remained recognizably himself while adapting to serve whatever narrative or philosophical purpose the story required. The success of these various interpretations proved that the character had achieved true mythological status, capable of supporting multiple contradictory interpretations while maintaining essential coherence and meaning. Like all genuine mythological figures, The Joker had become larger than any single story or interpretation, existing as a cultural touchstone that could be referenced, reimagined, and recontextualized across different media and creative visions, while retaining the core elements that made him immediately recognizable and eternally relevant. As these alternate versions continued to proliferate across different media and creative interpretations, the original Joker's influence extended far beyond his initial appearances to encompass an entire genre of chaos-based characters and philosophical explorations of the nature of meaning, morality, and social organization in the modern world. And in the wider culture, his masks multiply. Beyond Gotham Elseworlds, multiverses, and major non-canon turns, in the infinite expanse of the multiverse, where every possibility spawns its own reality, and every choice creates new worlds of consequence, the Joker's laugh echoes across dimensions with a resonance that transcends the boundaries of any single continuity. These alternate realities serve not merely as creative exercises or commercial exploitations of a popular character, but as laboratories for exploring the fundamental questions that the Joker represents. What happens when chaos triumphs absolutely? What becomes of a world where the joke is not merely told but lived? How does the absence of moral constraint reshape the very foundations of existence itself? The most terrifying answer to these questions emerged from the dark multiverse in the form of the Batman who laughs, a figure whose very existence represented the ultimate corruption of everything that Batman had ever stood for. Bruce Wayne of Earth, 22, had been exposed to a concentrated form of Joker toxin during what should have been his final confrontation with his greatest enemy. A chemical baptism that had stripped away his moral certainty and replaced it with the Joker's nihilistic clarity, while leaving intact all of Batman's tactical brilliance, strategic thinking, and comprehensive knowledge of heroic psychology. The horror of the Batman who laughs lay not in his descent into madness, but in his ascension to a form of terrible sanity that combined Batman's methodical approach to problem-solving with the Joker's absolute freedom from moral constraint. Here was a figure who possessed all of Batman's skills and resources, but who had been liberated from the ethical framework that had previously limited their application. His crimes weren't random acts of violence or theatrical demonstrations, but systematic campaigns designed to corrupt and destroy entire realities with the same efficiency that Batman had once brought to protecting them. The visual iconography of the Batman who laughs, the familiar cowl twisted into a rictus grin, the metal blindfold that covered eyes that had seen too much truth about the nature of existence, the chains that held rabid robins as attack, dog-screeded new vocabulary for depicting the complete inversion of heroic symbols. Every element of Batman's traditional appearance had been transformed into its opposite while maintaining recognizable similarity, creating uncanny valley effect that made the character simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The philosophical implications of this character extended far beyond simple what-if scenarios to encompass genuine questions about the relationship between morality and effectiveness in heroic action. The Batman who laughs represented proof that Batman's moral code wasn't merely personal preference but essential component of his identity as hero, that removing that moral framework didn't create a more effective Batman but something that was no longer Batman at all. Despite maintaining all of his surface characteristics and capabilities, the dark multiverse invasions orchestrated by the Batman who laughs demonstrated how the Joker's philosophy could be weaponized through Batman's strategic capabilities. His recruitment of other corrupted versions of familiar heroes, the Red Death, the Merciless, the Devastator, created an army of figures who had each fallen to different aspects of the chaos that the original Joker represented, proving that corruption could take multiple forms while serving the same ultimate purpose of destroying meaning and hope. The events of Dark Knight's Metal and its sequels established the Batman who laughs as a threat that transcended individual realities to encompass the entire structure of the multiverse itself. His understanding of how different realities connected and influenced each other, combined with his complete lack of moral restraint in exploiting those connections, made him capable of destroying not just individual worlds but the very concept of heroism across all possible realities. At the opposite end of the moral spectrum, Sean Murphy's Batman, White Knight presented an entirely different exploration of what the Joker could become when freed from the constraints of traditional continuity. the transformation of Jack Napier from homicidal maniac into rational social reformer represented a fascinating inversion that explored whether the Joker's criticism of Gotham's institutional failures might have validity, independent of his violent methodology. The White Knight universe's exploration of the Joker's potential for redemption raised disturbing questions about the nature of his relationship with Batman and the possibility that their eternal conflict served to maintain a status quo that benefited neither character nor the city they claimed to protect. Napier's systematic exposure of corruption within the GCPD, his revelation of the financial costs of Batman's vigilante activities, his documentation of the collateral damage caused by their conflicts all served to recontextualize their relationship as potentially codependent rather than genuinely heroic. The psychological complexity of the reformed Joker's relationship with Harley Quinn in this continuity provided insights into how his capacity for genuine human connection had been suppressed rather than eliminated by madness. His ability to form meaningful romantic partnership when freed from his obsession with Batman suggested that his isolation and nihilism might have been symptoms of his fixation on their conflict rather than fundamental aspects of his character. The Injustice universe presented perhaps the most successful example of the Joker, achieving his ultimate philosophical objective through a single, perfectly calculated action. His murder of Lois Lane and destruction of Metropolis succeeded not merely in killing Superman's wife and destroying his adopted city, but in transforming the Man of Steel into the kind of authoritarian ruler that the Joker had always insisted lurked beneath the surface of every hero's righteous facade. The genius of the Injustice Joker's final scheme lay in its recognition that heroes' greatest vulnerability wasn't their moral code, but their faith in that code's universal applicability. By creating a scenario where Superman's adherence to his traditional principles resulted in catastrophic loss, the Joker had proved that moral certainty was a luxury that could be stripped away by sufficient trauma, leaving even the most principled individuals vulnerable to the kind of extremism that he had always represented. The Joker's death at Superman's hands in the Injustice timeline represented both his ultimate victory and his final joke. He had succeeded in proving his point about the arbitrary nature of heroic morality so completely that his continued existence became unnecessary. His philosophy lived on through Superman's increasingly authoritarian methods and the civil war that divided the superhero community, demonstrating that ideas could be more dangerous than their originators and more difficult to destroy. The Flashpoint universe's revelation that Martha Wayne had become the Joker in the timeline where Bruce had died instead of his parents provided profound insights into how grief and trauma could manifest in different individuals exposed to identical circumstances. This version of the character possessed all of the traditional Joker's nihilistic philosophy and theatrical methodology, while being motivated by maternal loss rather than abstract philosophical conviction. The confrontation between Martha Wayne's Joker and her son Bruce in the Flashpoint timeline created one of the most emotionally devastating scenes in comic book history, as she was forced to confront the reality that her grief had transformed her into the kind of monster that her son had dedicated his life to fighting. Her suicide upon learning about Batman's existence in other timelines represented the ultimate expression of despair and the recognition that some forms of damage were too fundamental to repair. The Arkham video game universe, beginning with Arkham Asylum and culminating in Arkham Knight, provided an interactive exploration of the Joker's philosophy that allowed players to experience directly the psychological warfare and institutional corruption that defined his methodology. The game's progression from simple containment scenario to citywide chaos to posthumous psychological domination demonstrated how the character's influence could extend beyond death through carefully planted seeds of doubt, corruption. The Arkham Joker's final victory, his ability to corrupt Batman from beyond the grave through a combination of chemical alteration and psychological manipulation, represented the ultimate expression of his belief that anyone could be transformed into a version of himself given sufficient pressure and the right catalysts. The fear toxin-induced hallucinations that allowed the dead Joker to continue tormenting Batman proved that his true power had never been physical but psychological, existing in the realm of ideas and anxieties rather than mere criminal activity. The voice work of Mark Hamill throughout the Arkham series established new standards for how the character's vocal presentation could convey both manic humor and genuine menace simultaneously. His ability to shift instantaneously between childlike glee and cold calculation created audio portrait of a consciousness that existed outside normal emotional categories while remaining recognizably human in its fundamental loneliness and need for attention. The Batman Damned storyline by Brian Azzarello and Lee Bermejo pushed the character into genuinely supernatural territory, exploring what might happen if the Joker's apparent resurrections and seeming immortality were literal rather than merely dramatic convenience. The suggestion that he might be a demon or spiritual entity rather than merely human criminal provided new framework for understanding his relationship with Batman as potentially cosmic rather than merely personal conflict. The artistic achievement of these various interpretations demonstrated the character's remarkable flexibility as a creative vehicle. Whether portrayed as cosmic threat, political reformer, grieving mother, video game antagonist, or supernatural entity, the essential elements of his character, the laugh, the chaos, the philosophical nihilism, the obsession with proving that meaning was arbitrary remained consistent, while allowing for radical reinterpretation of his origins, methods, and ultimate objectives. The influence of these alternate versions on mainstream continuity was significant, with successful elements being incorporated into regular Batman comics, while unsuccessful experiments provided valuable lessons about which aspects of the character were essential and which were merely cosmetic. The multiverse approach allowed creators to test extreme interpretations without permanently damaging the character's core mythology, while providing fresh perspectives on familiar themes and relationships. The theological implications of these various interpretations also deserved consideration. The recurring theme of the Joker as tempter figure, the character who offered others the freedom of embracing chaos and meaninglessness, echoed religious traditions about the nature of evil and its relationship to free will and moral choice. His consistent role as the figure who forced heroes to confront the limitations and potential arbitrariness of their moral codes suggested archetypal significance that transcended comic book storytelling. Most significantly, these alternate interpretations established the Joker as a character whose essential nature was so fundamental to human psychology and social organization that he could manifest across any conceivable reality or circumstances. Whether as corrupted hero, reformed villain, grieving mother, or supernatural entity, he remained recognizably himself while adapting to serve whatever narrative or philosophical purpose the story required. The success of these various interpretations proved that the character had achieved true mythological status, capable of supporting multiple contradictory interpretations while maintaining essential coherence and meaning. Like all genuine mythological figures, the Joker had become larger than any single story or interpretation, existing as a cultural touchstone that could be referenced, reimagined, and recontextualized across different media and creative visions, while retaining the core elements that made him immediately recognizable and eternally relevant. As these alternate versions continued to proliferate across different media and creative interpretations, the original Joker's influence extended far beyond his initial appearances to encompass an entire genre of chaos-based characters and philosophical explorations of the nature of meaning, morality, and social organization in the modern world. And in the wider culture, his masks multiply.